Atlanta Ground Zero. When One Man Brings Down a Nation. By Cole Harmon. Copyright 2026 Cole Harmon. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. The Dying Village. The village of Aikila had no name on most maps. It sat deep in the Congolese rainforest, 3 hours by boat from the nearest town, surrounded by a wall of green so thick it swallowed sound and light in equal measure. The river that fed it was brown and slow, carrying silt from places no satellite had ever photographed. 83 people lived there. Farmers, fishermen, mothers, children, people who had never owned a smartphone, never seen a hospital, never heard of the CDC. By the time Dr. Adam Cross arrived, 41 of them were dead. He stepped off the small motorboat onto the muddy riverbank, pulling his surgical mask tight against his face. The heat hit him like a wall, wet, heavy, alive with a constant electric hum of insects. The sky above the treeline was a narrow strip of white, the kind of sky that gave no comfort. Behind him, his two-man team from whose field office in Kinshasa unloaded equipment in silence. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. The smell reached him before anything else. It was not the smell of death alone. Adam knew that smell, had cataloged it somewhere in the back of his mind the way a doctor catalogs unpleasant things, efficiently and without sentiment. This was something underneath the death, something biological and sharp, like copper mixed with rot. He filed it away without reacting. "God," muttered Hayes, the younger of the two field assistants, pressing his forearm hard against his nose. Adam didn't react. He walked forward. The village was a single row of wooden structures along the riverbank, some with corrugated metal roofs that had turned amber with rust, others still thatched with palm leaves gone dark from rain. Between the buildings, chickens wandered undisturbed, pecking at the ground with the indifferent focus of creatures that understood nothing of what had happened around them. A cooking fire near the central structure had burned down to cold gray ash. Someone had left a pot on it. Whatever was inside had long since dried to nothing. Somewhere inside one of the buildings a child was crying, a thin, exhausted sound that rose and fell and rose again like a broken signal searching for a frequency. Adam noted it, moved on. A local health worker named Bosco met them at the edge of the village. He was a small man in his 50s, wearing a yellow plastic apron over his clothes and latex gloves 2 sizes too big for his hands. He had improvised a face covering from a strip of cloth tied behind his head. It was not enough, they both knew it, but it was what he had, and he had stayed anyway. Adam respected that without saying so. His eyes told Adam everything before he opened his mouth. They were the eyes of a man who had watched too much in too short a time and had not yet found a place to put it. "It started 9 days ago," Bosco said in French, his voice flat with exhaustion. "One man, a fisherman named Luca, he came back from a northern tributary with a fever. We thought malaria. We always think malaria." He paused and looked at the ground. It was not malaria. "Describe the progression," Adam said, already moving toward the nearest structure, eyes scanning every surface, every face, every body. Day 1, fever, chills, muscle pain. Classic presentation. Day 2, the fever climbed. 40 degrees, 41. He stopped eating. Day 3, Bosco stopped walking. Adam stopped with him. Day 3, his skin began to change. Change how? Bruising, but not from impact, from inside. Bosco touched his own throat with 2 fingers. Here first, then spreading, like something was bleeding beneath the surface, but not breaking through. He resumed walking. By the 4th day, 3 others had the same symptoms. People who had been near Luca, his wife, 2 men who fished with him on the tributary. And Luca, Bosco said nothing for a moment. Luca died on the 5th day. I have never seen a man die that fast from anything that was not a bullet. Adam absorbed this without expression. How fast did it spread after that? 3 days, maybe 4. By the 5th day, we had 12 dead. By the 8th, 41. Bosco spread his hands in a gesture that was neither helplessness nor surrender. It was simply the gesture of a man presenting facts he could not change. I sent a message to Kinshasa on the 3rd day, then again on the 5th. Nobody came until you. Adam said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. They reached the entrance of the community hall, a long rectangular building that served as meeting place, school, and now, by necessity, hospital. Adam stopped in the doorway and let his eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside. On the floor, on improvised cots made from banana leaves layered under cloth, lay 11 people in various stages of the same progression Bosco had described. Some were unconscious, their breathing audible from the doorway, labored, wet, too fast. Others were awake, staring at the ceiling with the vacant expression of those two exhausted to do anything else. A woman in the far corner was murmuring something low and rhythmic, a prayer or a lullaby, her hand resting flat on the chest of a small child beside her. The child was not moving. Adam pulled on a second pair of gloves, checked his mask, and entered. He crouched beside the nearest conscious patient, a man of perhaps 40, his skin ashen and slick with sweat despite the heat. His breathing was shallow and rapid, but it was the bruising that stopped Adam entirely. It had spread from below the jaw down across the throat and collarbone in a pattern he had never seen in 22 outbreaks across 11 countries. Not the flat purple pooling of blunt trauma, not the pinpoint hemorrhaging of viral hemorrhagic fever. Something in between, dark, spreading, subcutaneous, moving outward from a central point like ink dropped into still water and left to find its own shape. Adam stared at it for a long moment. In his 11 years with the CDC, he had trained himself to feel nothing in the field. Emotion was a variable that contaminated observation. Whatever he felt, and he did feel things, regardless of what his colleagues believed, he stored it somewhere inaccessible until the work was done. It was the only way to function. It was, if he was honest, the reason he had no life outside of work. The storage unit had gotten too large to leave behind. But looking at that bruising, something moved in him that was not quite fear and not quite awe. It was an unmistakable sensation, standing at the edge of something unknown. A scientist's version of vertigo. He leaned closer. Has this pattern changed since it first appeared? He asked Bosco without turning. It grows, always outward, never receding. Adam opened his sample kit. Vials, swabs, needles, labels. He worked with the automatic precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times. But his mind was running hard, classifying, cross-referencing, eliminating. Known hemorrhagic viruses, Ebola, Marburg Lassa, Crimean Congo. None of them produced a specific bruising pattern. Known bacterial infections producing subcutaneous hemorrhaging. Several. But none with this rate of spread, none with this mortality curve. Whatever this was, he had not seen it before. That thought arrived quietly and settled with the weight of something important. Has anyone left the village since the outbreak began? He asked, labeling a vial with precise, small handwriting. Behind him, Bosco hesitated. It was a short hesitation, less than 2 seconds, but Adam heard it. One person. Bosco said carefully, a scientist from America. He was here for several weeks, studying the river ecosystem. Invertebrates, I think. He left 4 days ago. Adam stopped writing. He was in the village during the outbreak? Yes. He was here when Luca became sick. He helped us carry water on the 2nd day. He said he was not worried. He said he had a strong immune system. Bosco paused. He did not seem sick when he left. Adam set down the vial. He turned and looked at Bosco directly for the first time since they had entered the building. Where did he go? He said he was flying home. Bosco held Adam's gaze steadily. Atlanta, I think he said. He had a connecting flight from Kinshasa. The child in the corner had stopped breathing. The woman beside him had not yet noticed. Or perhaps she had, and the murmuring was all she had left to give him. Adam looked back at the bruising on the man's throat. Dark, spreading, moving outward from its origin like something searching for new territory. He picked up his vial and continued working. He did not yet know that in 72 hours he would be standing in the arrivals hall of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with a temperature of 38.7 degrees, his collar damp with sweat, telling himself it was nothing more than exhaustion from flight. He did not yet know that the man from Atlanta, the scientist with a strong immune system who had carried water on the second day, was already home, already moving through the city, already shaking hands, riding the subway, breathing recycled air in office buildings and coffee shops and hospital waiting rooms. He did not yet know that he was already too late. Chapter 2. Welcome Home. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was the busiest airport in the world. On any given day, 275,000 people passed through its terminals. Businessmen, tourists, students, families, soldiers coming home and soldiers shipping out. They arrived from everywhere and departed everywhere, a constant human current flowing through a building designed to move bodies from one place to another as efficiently as possible. Nobody thought about what else might be moving with them. Dr. Adam Cross landed at gate E32 at 6:47 in the evening on a Tuesday in March. He had been traveling for 19 hours, Kinshasa to Brussels, Brussels to Atlanta, and he felt it in every part of his body. His lower back had stiffened somewhere over the Atlantic. His eyes were dry and scratchy from recycled air. He had slept for perhaps 3 hours across the 2 flights, which was 3 hours more than he usually managed. He told himself that was why he felt the way he felt. The fever had started somewhere over the ocean. He had noticed it the way he noticed most things, methodically and without drama. A warmth behind his eyes, a faint heaviness in his limbs that was different from the familiar weight of exhaustion. He had pressed the back of his hand to his forehead the way people do when they suspect something they do not want to confirm, and felt the heat there, and told himself it was a recycled air in the cabin. Dehydration. The brutal combination of African heat and long-haul travel. He was a virologist. He knew better. He also knew that knowing better and acting on what you know are two entirely different things, and that doctors make the worst patients in the world precisely because they are capable of constructing very convincing medical arguments for whatever they want to believe. He wanted to believe he was fine, so he constructed the argument and accepted it and collected his bag from Carousel 7 and walked through the nothing-to-declare channel at customs without stopping. The customs officer barely looked up. Atlanta received him the way it always did, with noise and motion and the familiar smell of a large American city in early spring. Cold still in the air, but something warmer underneath it, a promise the season had not yet kept. He stood on the sidewalk outside the arrivals terminal for a moment, bag at his feet, and breathed it in, exhaust and fast food, and cut grass from somewhere distant. The sounds of 1,000 conversations happening simultaneously in a dozen languages, none of them his concern. He pulled out his phone and called the CDC. "Cross," said the voice of Dr. Patricia Voss, his direct supervisor, before he had said a word. She had a talent for answering phones, as though she already knew who was calling, and was mildly inconvenienced by it. "How bad?" "Bad," he said. "Unknown pathogen. Hemorrhagic presentation, but atypical bruising pattern. Subcutaneous. Radial spread from point of origin. Mortality rate above 50% in under 10 days. I've never seen the bruising pattern before." A pause. In 11 years, he had never told Patricia Voss he had never seen something before. He heard her register it. Samples. On their way to the lab. "I couriered them from Kinshasa before the flight." He shifted his bag to his other shoulder and winced slightly. His muscles ached in a way that felt deeper than travel fatigue, a soreness that seemed to come from somewhere inside rather than from the surface. He noted it and moved on. "There's something else." "Tell me." An American was in the village during the active outbreak phase. A researcher. He left 4 days ago, flying back to Atlanta. Adam paused, watching a yellow cab pull away from the curb with 3 passengers inside, heading into the city. He was in direct contact with infected individuals. He helped carry water on day 2 of the outbreak. "Name?" "I don't have it yet." Bosco is working on it from the village records. I should have it within 24 hours. I want it the moment you have it." Her voice had changed. Not louder, not harder, but more focused. The way a lens changes when something important comes into view. "Come in tomorrow morning. 7 sharp. I want a full debrief, and I want to see those bruising photographs. I'll be there." He ended the call and stood for another moment on the sidewalk. A family pushed past him. 2 adults, 3 children. The youngest asleep against his father's shoulder with a total surrender that only small children achieve. The mother was laughing at something, head thrown back, entirely unguarded. Normal. Everything around him was aggressively, indifferently normal. He thought about the woman in the corner of the community hall, her hand on the chest of the child who had stopped breathing. He thought about Bosco's face. He thought about the bruising spreading outward like dark water, finding its level. He took a cab into the city. The driver was a talkative man named Dennis who had opinions about the Braves and the traffic on I-285 and the best place to get fried chicken at this hour, which he shared without invitation and with considerable enthusiasm. Adam sat in the back seat and responded in single syllables and looked out the window at Atlanta rolling past. The glass towers of downtown catching the last of the evening light, the neighborhood spreading out beyond them, streets full of people going about the everyday business of a Tuesday evening. By the time they reached his apartment building in Midtown, it was past 8. Adam paid Dennis, carried his bag to the elevator, rode it to the 7th floor, unlocked his apartment, and stood in the entrance for a moment looking at the space he lived in. It was clean, orderly, almost entirely impersonal. A couch, a desk, bookshelves along one wall organized by subject rather than author, a kitchen that saw more coffee than food. No photographs on the walls, no plants, nothing that required care in his absence. He had designed his life to be portable, and this apartment was the purest expression of that design. He dropped his bag, went to the bathroom, and stood under a hot shower for 10 minutes. Afterward, he stood at the mirror and looked at himself. Stubble, shadows under his eyes, the hollow gauntness that fieldwork in equatorial heat always produced. He pressed the back of his hand to his forehead, warmer than before. He opened the medicine cabinet, found a thermometer, placed it under his tongue, and waited. When he took it out and read it, the number was 38.7. He stood there for a long moment looking at the number. Then he put the thermometer back in the cabinet, went to the kitchen, made himself a cup of tea he didn't finish, and went to bed. He set his alarm for 5:30. He had a 7 o'clock meeting with Patricia Voss, and he needed to be sharp. He would feel better in the morning. He was already not feeling better. He was already feeling worse, in the slow incremental way that serious illness disguises itself in its early hours as something manageable, something that sleep might fix, something that is almost certainly nothing. In the apartment 3 floors above him, his neighbor Mrs. Callahan was cooking dinner with her kitchen window open, humming to herself. The building's ventilation system ran quietly through the walls. Tomorrow morning Adam would ride the elevator down with 2 other residents, a young lawyer named Greg, who commuted by subway, and a nurse named Sandra, who worked at Grady Memorial Hospital 4 blocks away. He did not know any of this. He closed his eyes and was asleep within minutes, his immune system working in the dark against something it had never encountered before, losing ground it did not know it was losing. Outside, Atlanta kept being Atlanta, bright and loud, and entirely unaware of what had just walked through its door. Chapter 3. The Morning After. Adam's alarm went off at 5:30, and he silenced it before the second pulse. Old habit. He had never been a man who needed convincing to wake up. Sleep was something he did efficiently, like everything else, extracting what he needed from it and returning to consciousness without ceremony. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark. The fever was still there. He could feel it before he even reached the thermometer, a low, persistent heat behind his eyes, a heaviness in his joints that the night's sleep had not touched. His throat was dry. His muscles ached with that deep interior soreness he had noticed at the airport, unchanged, perhaps marginally worse. He went to the bathroom and took his temperature. 39.1, higher than last night. He stood at the mirror and looked at himself and ran to the differential with the automatic efficiency of a man who had been doing this for over a decade. Influenza, possible. Presentation consistent. Malaria. He had been taking prophylactics, but they were not infallible, especially in regions with resistant strains. Exhaustion-induced immune suppression with opportunistic infection. Likely contributing factor. Exposure to unknown pathogen in Aquila. He stopped that thought before it completed itself. He was in full PPE the entire time. He had followed every protocol. He had not touched a single patient without double-gloved hands and a sealed mask. The risk of exposure was minimal. The risk of exposure was not zero, but it was minimal, and minimal was close enough to nothing that a reasonable person could set aside and function. He was a reasonable person. He took 2 ibuprofen, drank a full glass of water, showered again, dressed, and made coffee. By 6:15, he was in his car heading toward the CDC campus on Clifton Road. The city's still mostly dark around him. The streets belonging to delivery trucks and early joggers and the narrow subset of people who start their days before the world catches up. He felt worse than he had in years. He told himself it was nothing. The CDC's Emergency Operations Center occupied a large open-plan floor in Building 21, a space designed to feel like controlled urgency. Rows of workstations, wall-mounted screens cycling through global disease surveillance data, the quiet intensity of people who understood that their job was to stand between the world and the things that wanted to end it. Adam had worked in this room for 9 years and still felt its specific weight every time he walked through the door. Patricia Voss was already at the central table when he arrived 7 minutes before 7. She was a tall woman in her early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the manner of someone who had stopped being impressed by things a long time ago but had not stopped caring about them. She looked up when he entered, assessed him in approximately 1 second, and said nothing about what she saw. He appreciated that. He set up his laptop, pulled up the photographs from Aquila, and began. He talked for 40 minutes without interruption. The village, the mortality rate, the progression timeline. Bosco, the bruising pattern. He brought up the photographs here and watched Patricia's expression do the same thing as it had done when he first saw it in person. A brief involuntary stillness that she controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. The samples en route to the lab. The unknown American researcher who had left 4 days before Adam arrived. When he finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. The bruising, she said. You're certain it's not consistent with any known hemorrhagic presentation? I've looked at everything in the literature. Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, CCHF, Neve. The subcutaneous radial spread pattern doesn't match any of them. It's close to some aspects of Marburg, but the distribution is wrong, and the speed is wrong. He paused. It moves faster than anything I've seen. The first patient was dead in 5 days. Most hemorrhagic fevers take longer to kill. What's your working hypothesis? Novel pathogen. Possibly a mutated filovirus. Possibly something we haven't classified yet. I won't know until the samples are processed. He looked at the photograph on his screen, the dark bruising spreading across the throat of the man on the floor of the community hall. Frozen there, permanent now. But whatever it is, it's efficient. The village had no infrastructure, no medical support, no containment protocols. That accounts for some of the mortality. In a controlled environment with early intervention, the numbers might be different. Might, Patricia said. Might, he agreed. She looked at him for a moment. You don't look well, Adam. I'm fine. Long travel. She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then moved on. The American researcher. Where are we on identification? Bosco was going to check the village records this morning. He should have a name within the hour. Adam's phone was face up on the table. He glanced at it. Nothing yet. Once we have a name, I can run it against passenger manifests, confirm the travel route, locate him. When we find him, I want him brought in for evaluation immediately, voluntary if possible. And if not voluntary? Patricia looked at him with the expression she reserved for her questions she considered already answered. We'll cross that bridge. Adam nodded. He reached for his coffee cup and noticed that his hand was not entirely steady. He set the cup down without drinking and moved it slightly to the left so that Patricia would not be looking directly at it. His phone buzzed. A message from Bosco. 2 words and a name. Found him. Daniel Marsh. Adam stared at the name for a moment. Then he opened a new search window and typed it in. Academic database first. Researcher, River Ecosystems, Atlanta-based institution. The results came back in 4 seconds. Dr. Daniel Marsh. Associate Professor of Freshwater Biology, Georgia Tech, 44 years old. Specialist in invertebrate ecosystems of Central African river systems. Currently on sabbatical research leave. Atlanta. Adam turned his laptop to face Patricia without a word. She read the screen. Then she picked up her phone and began making calls. While she talked, Adam sat back in his chair and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his own neck, just below the jaw, in the place where the bruising had begun on the man in the community hall. His lymph nodes were swollen. He pressed his fingers there for a long moment, feeling the familiar shape of something that should not be there, and looked at the photograph on his laptop screen. And for the first time since landing at Hartsfield-Jackson the previous evening, he allowed himself to complete the thought he had stopped in his bathroom mirror that morning. He had been in that village for 6 hours without incident. Daniel Marsh had been there for days. Adam was a trained field epidemiologist who had followed every protocol, worn every piece of protective equipment, touched nothing without appropriate precaution. Daniel Marsh had carried water, had sat with the sick, had lived among them without protection, because he had not known there was anything to protect against. Adam had a fever of 39.1 and swollen lymph nodes, and had just spent 40 minutes breathing the same recycled air as every person in this building. He lowered his hand from his neck. Across the table, Patricia Voss was on her second call, her voice steady and authoritative, already setting the machinery in motion to find Daniel Marsh. She had not looked at Adam in several minutes. Around them, the operations center was filling up, more people arriving, the urgent daily business of global disease surveillance finding its rhythm. Nobody was looking at him. He thought about the elevator that morning. Greg the lawyer and Sandra the nurse, both of whom he had stood within a 4-by-6-foot metal box for 30 seconds, while the building's ventilation pushed air in slow circles around all 3 of them. He thought about Dennis the cab driver, talking about the Braves for 20 minutes in a sealed vehicle. He thought about the arrivals hall at Hartsfield-Jackson, 275,000 people passing through every single day. He picked up his phone and looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it face down on the table and told himself he would wait for the lab results. He would wait for confirmation. He would not create a crisis based on a fever and a hypothesis. He was a reasonable person. Outside Building 21, on the CDC campus that existed specifically to prevent the thing that Adam Cross was quietly refusing to acknowledge was already happening. The March morning was bright and cold and entirely ordinary. The city beyond the campus boundary went about its business. And somewhere in Atlanta, Dr. Daniel Marsh was waking up. Chapter 4. The Wrong Kind of Silence. The apartment of Dr. Daniel Marsh was on the 4th floor of a brick building in Virginia Highland, one of those Atlanta neighborhoods that had decided sometime in the 90s to be charming and had never stopped. Tree-lined streets, independent coffee shops, weekend farmers markets, the kind of place where people walked their dogs twice a day and knew their neighbors by name. The CDC field team arrived at 9:47 in the morning. 2 agents in plain clothes, a public health officer named Rivera, and a paramedic unit parked half a block away out of sight. Patricia Voss had been precise about the optics. No uniforms, no obvious medical equipment visible from the street, nothing that would alarm the neighbors before they had a handle on the situation. Adam was not there. Patricia had told him to go home and rest. He had gone back to his office instead. He was watching the operation through Rivera's body camera feed on his laptop when Daniel Marsh opened his apartment door. The man on the screen was tall, lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He was wearing a Georgia Tech sweatshirt and holding a mug of coffee. He looked surprised to find two people he didn't know standing in his hallway, but not alarmed. Not yet. Adam leaned closer to his screen. Even through the low resolution of the body camera feed, he could see it, just below Marsh's jaw, disappearing under the collar of his sweatshirt. Dark, spreading. The bruising had already begun. Rivera's voice on the feed was calm and practiced, the particular tone of someone trained to deliver alarming information in a way that did not immediately produce panic. She identified herself, showed credentials, explained that they were conducting a routine follow-up on a public health matter related to his recent travel to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Marsh's expression shifted, not to fear exactly, to the careful stillness of a man who was intelligent enough to understand that routine follow-up was not a phrase that preceded good news. "Is this about the village?" he asked. Rivera paused almost imperceptibly. "What village is that, Dr. Marsh?" "Aquila. I was working near there for 3 weeks. There was some kind of illness spreading through the village while I was in the area." He looked at his coffee mug, then back at Rivera. "I helped out a little, carrying water, basic things. I wasn't really in direct contact with anyone sick." He was lying, not maliciously. Adam recognized the unmistakable flavor of a lie told to oneself first and others second. Marsh had been in contact. He had minimized it in his memory, because minimizing it was more comfortable than the alternative. "We'd like you to come in for a brief evaluation," Rivera said. "Just a precaution. It shouldn't take more than a few hours." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the second agent in the hallway. Then he looked down at his coffee mug again. "I've had a headache for 2 days," he said quietly, "and a fever. I thought it was jet lag." "When did you get back?" Rivera asked. "4 days ago." He looked up. "How bad is it? Whatever was in that village, how bad is it?" Rivera did not answer immediately. In the half-second of her pause, Adam watched Marsh's face go through something. A series of small recalibrations. A man updating his understanding of his own situation in real time. He had known something was wrong. People always knew, on some level, before they were told. "We'd like to do the evaluation first," Rivera said. "Then we can answer your questions properly." Marsh nodded slowly. He set his coffee mug on a table, just inside the door, with the careful deliberateness of someone performing a normal action for possibly the last time. He picked up his jacket from a hook on the wall. "Let me get my keys," he said. "You won't need them," Rivera said gently. "We have a vehicle." Another pause, longer this time. Adam watched Marsh absorb the full meaning of that. No keys, CDC at his door, a vehicle already waiting. A man did not need to be a doctor to understand what that added up to. "All right," Marsh said, very quietly. "All right." They brought him to the isolation unit at Emory University Hospital, the same unit that had handled Ebola cases a decade earlier, for rooms of negative pressure containment behind double-sealed doors and airlock entry protocols. It was the right facility. It was one of perhaps 3 facilities in the country equipped to handle what Marsh might be carrying. Adam received the intake report at 11:15. Temperature, 39.4. Lymphadenopathy present. Swollen nodes in the neck and jaw. Subcutaneous bruising pattern noted at the throat and collarbone. Early stage. Consistent with what Adam had documented in Aquila. No respiratory symptoms yet. Cognitive function intact. Patient alert and cooperative. He read the report twice. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out the thermometer he had brought from home that morning. He had been taking his temperature every 2 hours since the 7 o'clock meeting. He placed it under his tongue and waited. 39.3. He wrote the number in a small notebook he had started keeping alongside the previous readings. A column of numbers climbing in slow increments, each one a data point in an experiment he had not chosen to run. He sat for a moment looking at the number. Down the hall, someone was laughing at something. a bright, uncomplicated sound that reached him through the closed door of his office. Outside his window, the CDC campus was going about its morning. People crossing the quad between buildings, a maintenance crew working on something near Building 18, a group of interns following a supervisor in a cluster of focused attention. Normal. Everything normal. Adam thought about Sandra, the nurse from the third floor of his building, currently somewhere in Grady Memorial Hospital, moving through wards, touching surfaces, breathing shared air with patients who were already compromised. He thought about Greg, the lawyer, in some office downtown, shaking hands, attending meetings. He thought about Dennis, the cab driver, and every fare Dennis had picked up since Tuesday evening. He thought about the arrivals hall at Hartsfield-Jackson. 275,000 people a day. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He had no confirmation yet. The lab results from Aquila were still being processed. Another 6 to 8 hours minimum before he had anything definitive. He could not walk into Patricia Voss's office and tell her he thought he was infected based on a fever and swollen lymph nodes that could have a dozen other explanations. He was a scientist. He needed data. And he needed it to tell him something other than what his lymph nodes and his thermometer and 11 years of field experience were already telling him. His phone buzzed. A text from the lab. Preliminary results ready. Come down. Adam stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out his office and down the corridor toward the laboratory with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who was in complete control of the situation. His hands were not shaking. He made sure of that. The lab technician's name was Patel. She was 29 years old, meticulous, and constitutionally incapable of small talk, which Adam had always appreciated. She was standing at her workstation when he arrived, 2 printed pages in her hand, and she looked at him with an expression he recognized. The expression of someone who has found something and is not sure how to begin. Talk to me, Adam said. She handed him the pages. He read them standing up. It took 4 minutes. Patel did not speak. The lab around them hummed with its ordinary sounds. Centrifuges, ventilation, the soft percussion of keyboards. When he finished reading, he lowered the pages and looked at the wall in front of him for a moment. The pathogen from Aquila was a filovirus. That much was consistent with his field hypothesis. But the genetic sequencing showed something that made the room feel suddenly smaller and the ventilation suddenly more relevant. It was not Ebola. It was not Marburg. It shared structural characteristics with both, but diverged at multiple critical points. The surface glycoproteins were different. The replication mechanism was faster, and there was a sequence in the genome that Patel had flagged in red that she had not been able to match to anything in the global viral database. It was new, completely, verifiably unprecedented new. The transmission mechanism, Adam said. His voice was steady. What are we looking at? Patel hesitated for just a moment. Based on the genomic structure and the field data you provided, the speed of spread in the village, the contact patterns, she stopped. Started again. It looks like respiratory transmission is possible. In addition to direct contact, the room was definitely smaller now. Possible or confirmed? Possible. We need more samples and more time to confirm. She paused. But the structure suggests it. The surface proteins are configured for her. She stopped again, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood exactly what they meant. For efficient airborne transmission, Adam set the pages down on the workstation with great precision, aligning them with the edge of the surface. He thought about the elevator. 30 seconds. A 4x6-foot box. Recycled air. He thought about the cab. 20 minutes. Sealed windows. He thought about this building right now. The air moving through its ventilation system in slow, invisible currents. Touching everything, reaching everywhere. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Voss. She answered on the second ring. I need you to come to the lab, he said. And I need you to come alone. A pause. Adam. Please, he said. Come now. He ended the call and stood in the lab with Patel's preliminary results in front of him and his temperature at 39.3 and the ventilation humming quietly overhead, and thought about a word He had been refusing to think since he had read the mortality data from Ikela. The word was airborne. It sat in his mind now like the bruising on that man's throat. Dark, spreading, moving outward from its point of origin with a patience that had nothing to do with mercy. Outside the laboratory window, Atlanta went on being Atlanta. It did not have much longer to do so. Chapter 5. The Confession. Patricia Voss arrived at the laboratory 4 minutes after Adam's call. She came alone as he had asked, closing the door behind her with the quiet precision of someone who understood that a closed door meant something was about to be said that could not be unsaid. She looked at Patel. Patel looked at Adam. Adam nodded once, and Patel gathered her things and left without being asked, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click that sounded, in the silence of the lab, considerably louder than it was. Patricia picked up the preliminary results from the workstation and read them. She read them the way she read everything, completely without interruption, without visible reaction. When she finished, she set them down and looked at Adam. Airborne transmission, she said. Not a question. Possible. Not yet confirmed. But the genomic structure strongly suggests it. He paused. Patel flagged a sequence she couldn't match to anything in the database. This is a novel pathogen. Completely novel. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Outside the laboratory window, a maintenance crew was still working near Building 18. 2 men in orange vests moving with the unhurried ease of people who did not know that 12 feet above them someone was about to say something that would change the next several months of their lives. What else? Patricia said. Adam had known this moment was coming since he had read the thermometer that morning. He had rehearsed it in the elevator, in the corridor, walking to the lab. He had constructed 3 different versions of how to say it, clinical, factual, detached. And now that the moment was here, all 3 versions dissolved, and what came out was simply the truth, unadorned. I have a fever of 39.3, he said. Swollen lymph nodes, bilateral jaw and neck, muscle pain, fatigue, elevated heart rate. He held her gaze. Onset approximately 36 hours ago. Consistent with early-stage presentation of what we documented in Ikela. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Adam counted them. Patricia did not look away. She did not change expression. She was the most controlled person Adam had ever worked with, and in 11 years, he had never once seen her lose that control. Not during the H1N1 response. Not during Ebola. Not during any of the 17 major outbreak responses. He had worked under her supervision. She was controlled now, but something moved behind her eyes. Something that in a less disciplined face would have been fear. How long have you known? She asked. I suspected at the airport. I confirmed this morning. He paused. I should have told you at 7 o'clock. I didn't because I didn't have lab confirmation, and I didn't want to. He stopped. Started again. I didn't want it to be true. Another silence. Shorter this time. Who have you been in contact with since landing? And there it was. The question he had been dreading more than any other, because the answer to it was a full measure of what he had done by waiting. He told her everything. Dennis, the cab driver. Tuesday evening, 20 minutes in a sealed vehicle. Mrs. Callahan upstairs, unknowing. Her kitchen window open to the building's shared air. Greg, the lawyer, and Sandra, the nurse. 30 seconds in the elevator. Wednesday morning. The 7 o'clock meeting. Himself, Patricia, and 4 other senior staff in a conference room for 40 minutes. The corridor between his office and this laboratory. Walked twice this morning. Every person he had passed. Every surface he had touched. Every breath he had exhaled into shared space over the past 36 hours. Patricia listened without interrupting. She was already thinking. He could see it. The rapid internal calculation of a woman who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of arithmetic. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Sandra, she said, the nurse. Grady Memorial. She left for her shift at 6:40 this morning. Patricia picked up her phone. She made 3 calls in rapid succession, each one precise and brief. The kind of calls that set large things in motion with small words. Adam stood and listened and felt the strange, dissociated calm of a man watching consequences he has created begin to unfold at a speed he can no longer control. When she finished, she set the phone down and looked at him. "You're going to Emory," she said. "Same unit as Marsh. Negative pressure isolation." She said it without cruelty, but without softness either. It was a fact, not a punishment, and they both knew it. Adam nodded. He had known this was coming too. "Your key card is suspended as of now. I'll need your phone." She held out her hand. He looked at the phone for a moment. Then he placed it in her hand. "Patricia!" He said her name and then stopped because what he wanted to say was too large and too late, and she already knew it anyway. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite anger, something more complex than either, the expression of a person holding two contradictory things at once and refusing to let either one win. "I know," she said. Then, very quietly, "We'll figure out." She walked to the door, opened it, and spoke briefly to someone in the corridor. Two people in full PPE appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds. They had been ready, Adam realized. Patricia had been ready since the moment she walked in. She had read the situation faster than he had given her credit for, which he supposed he should have expected. He walked toward the door. "Stopped. The samples from Aquila," he said. "The full genomic sequencing. There's a mutation in the replication mechanism that I want Patel to look at specifically. The speed of cellular invasion is anomalous even for a filovirus. If we understand why it replicates that fast, we might find a point of intervention." Patricia looked at him. "Adam!" "I know, but write it down. Tell Patel the replication mechanism. It matters." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, took out a pen, and wrote it down. He walked out of the laboratory between the two figures in white PPE suits, down the corridor of Building 21, past the ordinary busy morning of the CDC going about its work, out into the cold March air of the campus. A vehicle was already waiting. Someone had thought of everything. He got in without looking back. Through the window, as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, he watched the CDC campus recede. The buildings he had worked in for 11 years, the quad he had crossed 10,000 times, the place that was the closest thing he had to a home. He pressed two fingers to the side of his neck. The swelling was worse than this morning. He thought about the community hall, in Aquila, the man on the floor with the bruising spreading across his throat like dark water, the woman in the corner with her hand on the chest of the child who had stopped moving. He thought about what it meant that his blood contained something unique, something that had allowed him to be exposed and survive, so far, when others had not. Patel had flagged in preliminary results almost as an aside, a footnote to the larger findings. But Adam had seen it and filed away with particular attention he reserved for things that seemed small but weren't. His immune response was different, measurably, documentably different. His body was doing something to this virus that Luca the fisherman's body had not been able to do, that Daniel Marsh's body was currently failing to do. He didn't know why yet. But somewhere in that difference, he suspected, was the only thing that mattered now. Outside the vehicle window, Atlanta moved past. Streets full of people going about their Tuesday morning, buying coffee, walking dogs, sitting in traffic, living their ordinary lives in complete ignorance of the fact that somewhere in their city clock had started counting down. Dr. Adam Cross, patient 0, sat in the back of a CDC vehicle heading toward an isolation unit at Emory University Hospital, and for the first time since landing at Hartsfield-Jackson, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. It was considerable. He sat with it in silence and watched the city go by and thought about the replication mechanism and the anomalous immune response and the dark bruising spreading outward from its point of origin, and he told himself that there was still time. He told himself that because the alternative was not something he was willing to consider yet. Chapter 6. Room 4. The isolation unit at Emory University Hospital occupied a corner of the 4th floor that felt deliberately separate from the rest of the building, a deliberate architectural quarantine. as though the people who had designed it understood that what happened in these 4 rooms should not contaminate the steady business of healing that went on everywhere else. Room 4 was at the end of the corridor, past the airlock, past the double-sealed doors, past the nurse's station staffed by people in full PP who moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to working in conditions that most of their colleagues would find suffocating. It was a clean room, white and spare, with a hospital bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto a narrow strip of parking lot, and beyond that a line of trees that were just beginning to show the first tentative green of early spring. Adam sat on the edge of bed and looked at the trees. He had been in isolation units before, had visited patients in them, had consulted on cases through glass, had stood on the outside looking in with the detached clinical attention of someone for whom the bearer was professional rather than personal. He had never been on the inside. It was different on the inside. Not smaller, exactly. The room was adequately sized, but there was a quality to the air, filtered, recycled, entirely controlled, that made itself known in a way that ordinary air did not. You only noticed air when it was controlled. He noticed it now. A nurse named Torres had processed his admission with brisk, impersonal efficiency, vital signs, blood draw, medical history, current medications. She had spoken to him with the measured warmth reserved for patients who were also medical colleagues, a warmth that acknowledged the awkwardness of the situation without dwelling on it. He had appreciated that. His temperature on admission, 39.4, rising. Daniel Marsh was in room 2, 2 doors down the corridor. Adam knew this from the intake paperwork he had been given. The unit census. 3 patients currently in isolation. Himself the newest. He had not seen Marsh. He would not see Marsh. That was the nature of this place. Proximity without contact, nearness without connection. He wondered if Marsh knew he was here. He wondered what Marsh was feeling, 2 doors away, in his own white room with his own managed air and his own view of the parking lot. Marsh had been here longer. Marsh's bruising was more advanced. Marsh did not have whatever anomaly Adam's immune system apparently possessed. Adam thought about that anomaly with the focused attention of a man who has decided that thinking about it is the most useful thing he can do with the hours ahead of him. His body was fighting this thing differently. His cellular response to the pathogen was producing something. He didn't know what yet. The full blood work wouldn't be back until tomorrow. That was slowing the progression, not stopping it. Slowing it. That distinction mattered enormously. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything he knew about filovirus immune response, about neutralizing antibodies, about the specific mechanisms by which some individuals survived hemorrhagic fever exposure when the majority did not. He ran through it systematically, the way he ran through everything, building a framework from what was known and marking clearly the places where knowledge ended and hypothesis began. He was still doing this when someone knocked on the glass. He turned his head. Patricia Voss was standing on the other side of the observation window, in full PP, her face visible behind the visor. She was holding a legal pad and a pen. He sat up. She held the pad up to the glass. She had written on it in large, clear letters, "Sandra is fine. Brought in for evaluation. No symptoms." Adam felt something release in his chest that he hadn't realized he was holding. She turned the pad over. The other side. Greg, also fine. Dennis the driver, still locating. He nodded. She wrote something else. Turned the pad. Lab working on full genomic sequence. Patel is on the replication mechanism. He nodded again. Then he held up one finger. Wait, and looked around the room. There was a notepad on the bedside table. A standard hospital notepad with the Emory logo in the corner. He picked it up and wrote in large letters and held it to the glass. My blood work. The immune response anomaly. Priority. Patricia read it. Wrote on her pad. Already flagged. Hematology team on it. He lowered the notepad. Looked at her through the glass for a moment. His supervisor of 11 years. The closest thing he had to a professional anchor, standing in full protective equipment in a hospital corridor because she could not be in the same room as him. He wrote one more thing and held it up. How bad outside? Patricia looked at the question for a long moment. Then she wrote her answer slowly, deliberately, and held it up. Getting there meant different things depending on who you were. For the CDC, it meant the Emergency Operations Center had been elevated to full activation. All leave canceled. The incident command structure engaged. It meant calls to the WHO, to FEMA, to the Department of Homeland Security. It meant the quiet, rapid machinery of public health emergency response beginning to turn, slowly at first, as it always did, because the machinery was large and the people operating it were careful, and careful people did not move fast until they were certain. They were becoming certain. For the city of Atlanta, it meant something else entirely, because the city of Atlanta did not yet know that anything was happening. There had been no announcement. There would not be one today, and possibly not tomorrow, not until the epidemiological picture was clearer, not until contact tracing had progressed far enough to understand the scope, not until the people whose job it was to make these decisions had decided that the cost of telling the public was lower than the cost of not telling them. That calculation was ongoing. For Dennis, the cab driver, whose last name was Washington and who had driven his yellow cab for 14 years and who had picked up a quiet, distracted fare outside the International Arrivals Terminal on a Tuesday evening and talked about the Braves all the way to Midtown, it meant nothing yet. Dennis Washington did not know he was being looked for. He was currently on his ninth fare of the day, a businesswoman heading to the airport, and he was telling her about a restaurant in Decatur that did the best fried catfish in the state of Georgia. He felt fine. For now. Adam woke at 2 a.m. to find that his fever had climbed to 39.8. He lay in the filtered air of room 4 and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the isolation unit at night, the soft footsteps of the night staff, the distant hum of the ventilation system, the occasional beep of monitoring equipment from somewhere down the corridor. The same sounds existed in every hospital in the world. The universal texture of places where people came to either get better or not. He thought about Luca the fisherman, dead on the 5th day. He thought about his own anomalous immune response and what it might mean and whether it would be enough. He thought about the replication mechanism that Patel was studying in the lab and the neutralizing antibodies that his blood might or might not be producing, and the narrow distance between a treatment and a cure and the narrower distance still between enough time and not enough. He thought about Atlanta sleeping outside these walls. 2 million people breathing the shared air of a city that did not know what was moving through it. Then he stopped thinking about all of it, because thinking about all of it at 2 a.m. in an isolation unit with fever of 39.8 was not useful, and useless things were things Adam Cross had spent his entire adult life refusing to indulge. He closed his eyes. He thought instead about the one thing that was still in his control, the science, the framework he had been building since he laid down that afternoon, the structure of what was known and what was hypothesized and what needed to be tested. He thought about it with a focused, almost meditative attention that had always been a particular gift, the ability to hold a complex problem in his mind and turn it slowly in the dark until the angles became visible. There was something in his blood. There was something in his blood that was different, and that difference was the only leverage he had. And leverage was enough. It had to be enough. He lay in room 4 and thought about his blood, and outside the window the trees stood in the dark showing their first tentative green, and Atlanta slept on, unknowing, for what might be one of the last ordinary nights it would have for a very long time. Chapter 7. The Fair. Dennis Washington started every morning the same way. 4:47 a.m., alarm on his phone, a gospel track, not too loud, enough to wake him without waking Cheryl. Coffee made the night before, reheated in the microwave for exactly 90 seconds while he put on his uniform, which was not really a uniform but what he called his work clothes, dark trousers, a clean shirt, the Atlanta Braves cap he had owned for 6 years and replaced twice with the identical model because some things you did not change. He kissed Cheryl on the forehead. She never woke up. He had been doing this for 14 years, and she had never once woken up, and he loved her for it in a way that was too quiet and too familiar to need naming. By 5:15 he was in the cab, engine running, heading toward the airport. The city at this hour was his favorite version of itself. Empty streets, orange sodium light, the deep silence of a place that had not yet remembered it was supposed to be loud. He drove through it with the easy confidence of a man who knew every intersection, every shortcut, every block of the city the way other men knew their own houses. Atlanta was his house. He had grown up in Vine City, driven every neighborhood in 30 years of living here, watched the city change around him in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes not and always inevitable. He loved it anyway. That was the thing about cities. You loved them the way you love difficult people. Not despite the complications, but somehow because of them. His first fare of the day was a businesswoman heading downtown. Phone already open, typing before she had finished closing the door. He said good morning. She said Harmon. He drove. His second fare was an elderly man named Mr. Beaumont who needed to get to Piedmont Hospital for an early appointment and who wanted to talk about his knee, which Dennis was happy to listen to because Mr. Beaumont was a regular, and regulars were the architecture of a good day. His third fare was a young woman who had clearly not slept and smelled faintly of a bar and who fell asleep in the back seat before they had gone 2 blocks and whom Dennis woke gently when they reached her address in East Atlanta, saying, "We're here," missing the same tone he used with his granddaughter. By 9 o'clock, he had done 6 fares and was parked near Ponce de Leon Avenue eating a breakfast sandwich from a place he had been going to for 11 years. The woman behind the counter was named Gloria, and she always put extra hot sauce on his egg without being asked because she had been doing it for 11 years, and some things you did not need to say out loud. He felt good, a little tired maybe. He had woken in the night with a dry throat and a headache that had faded by morning, the kind of thing that happened when the seasons change, when Atlanta air went from cold to warm in the unreliable way it always did in March. He drank his coffee and ate his sandwich and listened to the radio. The radio was playing traffic and weather and the ordinary sediment of morning news. A city council vote, a water main break in Buckhead, the Braves opening series 3 weeks away. Dennis had opinions about the Braves roster that he was prepared to share with any fare that showed the slightest interest, and several that didn't. Nothing on the radio suggested that anything was wrong. His 7th fare of the day was a man in a suit outside a hotel on Peachtree Street who needed to get to a meeting in Sandy Springs and who spent the entire ride on a phone call that Dennis could not help overhearing. Something about a contract, a deadline, a colleague who had not shown up this morning and wasn't answering his phone. "It's not like Greg," the man said, with the irritated concern of someone whose irritation and concern were fighting for dominance. "He's never just, I don't know. His wife says he's been told to stay home. Some kind of health thing." Dennis drove and did not listen, and listened anyway, the way you did when you spent 14 years in a box with strangers. His 8th fare was a mother with 2 small children heading to the zoo. The younger child, a boy of perhaps 3, spent the entire ride with his face pressed against a window, saying car, car, truck, car, big truck, with the devoted attention of a scientist cataloging data. Dennis told him the big truck was a cement mixer, and the boy repeated cement mixer approximately 15 times with increasing satisfaction. This was the part of the job nobody talked about. The glimpses. 14 years of glimpses into other people's lives, collected and stored in no particular order, meaning nothing individually, and something large and unnameable in aggregate. Dennis Washington knew things about human beings that no study had ever measured. How they sat when they were frightened, how they talked when they were in love, how they looked out the window when they were trying not to cry. He knew, without knowing that he knew it, how a city sounded when it was healthy. He was beginning to notice, without being able to say why, that something today sounded slightly different. It started small. A fare canceled mid-route. A woman who took a call and said, "I'm sorry, I need to get out here," and got out on a corner that was not her destination and walked quickly in the other direction with her phone pressed to her ear. A delivery driver he recognized from the Ponce de Leon run, parked outside a pharmacy, who waved at Dennis with an expression that was not quite his usual expression. The pharmacy itself, he noticed it as he passed, a small thing, probably nothing, had a line that extended out the door and down the sidewalk. Pharmacies did not usually have lines at 10:30 in the morning. He filed these things away without examining them. The city was full of small anomalies, on any given day. This was not unusual. This was Atlanta. His ninth fare was a woman named Dr. Kim, which he knew because she said, "I'm Dr. Kim," when she got in, with the automatic identification of someone accustomed to being in professional contexts. She was heading to Grady Memorial Hospital. She was on her phone before the door closed, and unlike the businessman, she was not talking about contracts. "How many?" she said. Then, "Since when?" Then, after a pause that Dennis felt without understanding, "I'm 7 minutes away." She ended the call and looked out the window with the expression Dennis had cataloged 10,000 times in 14 years. The expression of someone receiving information they had been trained to receive but had not expected to receive today. "Everything okay?" he said. He always asked. Most people said yes. Some people needed to be asked. Dr. Kim looked at his eyes in the rear-view mirror for a moment. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Physically. Any fever, headache, muscle pain?" Dennis blinked. "I'm fine. Little headache this morning, but it's gone." She held his gaze in the mirror for a moment too long. "Good," she said. Then she looked back out the window. "That's good." She did not say anything else for the remaining 6 minutes of the ride. When she got out at Grady Memorial, she paid, tipped generously, and then paused with the door half open. "Get some rest tonight," she said. "Drink plenty of water." Dennis watched her walk quickly through the hospital entrance without looking back. He sat for a moment with the engine running. The radio was playing a song he liked. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, breathing, going about its business with the cheerful indifference of a place too large to notice its own symptoms. Dennis pulled back into traffic. His throat was dry again. He told himself it was the weather. March in Atlanta, one day cold, one day warm, the air never quite making up its mind. He had been driving in it all morning with the window cracked the way he always did. It dried you out. That was all. He reached for his water bottle and drank and merged onto Peachtree Street and looked for his next fare. Behind him, through the windows of Grady Memorial Hospital, Dr. Kim was already moving fast through corridors that were, for the first time that morning, beginning to feel like they were filling up faster than they should. Dennis Washington did not know this. He turned up the radio and drove. Chapter 8. The First Crack. The press conference was not supposed to happen on Thursday. Patricia Voss had argued against it in 3 separate calls with the director of the CDC, twice with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and once with a man from the White House whose title she was never clearly given, but whose presence on the call told her everything she needed to know about how far up the chain this had already traveled. Her argument was simple and correct. They did not yet have enough information. The contact tracing was incomplete. The transmission data was preliminary. Announcing a potential airborne pathogen to a city of 2 million people before you had a containment strategy was not public health. It was panic management. And panic management was not the same thing as management. She lost the argument. The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 11 in the morning, Grady Memorial Hospital had logged 14 cases with presentation consistent with the Aquila pathogen. Fever above 38.5, lymphadenopathy. The early subcutaneous bruising that Adam had documented in the Congo, and that was now appearing on throats and collarbones in a hospital 4 miles from the CDC campus. 14 cases in one morning. The previous evening there had been 2. Dr. Kim had called Patricia directly at 9:47, 7 minutes after arriving at the hospital, because Dr. Kim was the kind of person who called the right people immediately, and Patricia Voss was always the right person. "We have a cluster," Kim had said without preamble. 6 patients presenting within 90 minutes of each other. Same symptom profile. "I've seen the CDC bulletin from this morning. This matches." "Isolate them," Patricia said. "Full precautions. Nobody in or out of that ward without PPE. Already done." A pause. "Patricia, one of them is a nurse. She works this ward. She's been here since 6 this morning." "Sandra." Patricia had closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and continued working. By 11, the 14 cases had become 19. By 11:30, 23. The machine that Patricia had spent 30 years helping to build, the protocols, the response structures, the carefully designed escalation procedures, was turning now at full speed. Contact tracers were working through the lists. The state health department had been notified. The governor's office was involved. The National Guard had been quietly placed on standby by someone who had decided that quietly was the right way to do it for now. Quietly was ending at 2 o'clock. Adam watched the press conference on the television mounted on the wall of room 4. He had been given a tablet that morning. A concession of the fact that a man of his disposition could not simply lie in a hospital bed and exist without going quietly insane. He had spent the morning reading every piece of research on filovirus immune response that the CDC digital library contained, making notes on a hospital notepad in his small, precise handwriting. Building the framework he had started the night before into something more structured, more actionable. His temperature that morning had been 39.6. It had not gone higher. It had also not gone lower. It was holding, which was either encouraging or meaningless depending on how optimistic you were feeling. And Adam Cross was not by nature an optimistic man. He set the tablet down when the press conference began. The director of the CDC stood at a podium with the seal of the Department of Health and Human Services behind him and the flags of the United States and the state of Georgia on either side, and he spoke in the measured, careful tones of a man who had rehearsed this statement many times and was now delivering it with the careful, controlled energy of someone trying to say a frightening thing in an unfrightening way. Adam had written parts of that statement himself, from his hospital bed, via Patricia. He recognized his sentences, the clinical precision, the careful qualification, the deliberate avoidance of the word pandemic. The director spoke for 6 minutes. He described a novel pathogen of concern. He described a small number of cases currently under evaluation in Atlanta medical facilities. He described robust containment measures already in place. He used the word precautionary 4 times. He used the word concern twice. He did not use the word airborne. That had been a deliberate decision made at a level above Patricia's. And she had told Adam about it through the glass with an expression that communicated exactly what she thought of it. He took 3 questions from reporters. The 3rd question was from a woman in the 3rd row who asked, in a voice that was professionally calm and personally alarmed, whether residents of Atlanta should be concerned about going to work, taking public transportation, visiting hospitals. The director said that there was no reason for undue concern at this time, and that the situation was being actively monitored. Adam turned off the television. The city heard the press conference the way cities hear things. Partially, imperfectly, filtered through 1,000 different receivers and interpreted through 1,000 different frameworks. Some people watched it fully, sitting forward in their chairs, and felt the sharp clarity of understanding exactly what was being said underneath what was being said. Some people caught the headline on their phone. CDC announces novel pathogen cases in Atlanta, and felt a brief flutter of something before a notification from another app pulled their attention elsewhere. Some people did not hear it at all. Dennis Washington heard it on the radio between his 11th and 12th fares of the day, a truncated version read by a presenter who moved from it to a traffic report on I-285 with the smooth professional transition of someone for whom all news was equal. Dennis turned up the volume for the CDC part, and then turned it back down when the traffic came on. Novel pathogen, small number of cases, robust containment. He thought about Dr. Kim in the back of his cab that morning. How are you feeling? Any fever, headache, muscle pain? He thought about his dry throat. He thought about the quiet fare he had picked up Tuesday evening outside international arrivals. The man with the bag who had barely spoken, who had sat in the back seat with the stillness of someone very tired or very preoccupied, who had tipped adequately and gotten out on a midtown street without looking back. Dennis was not a doctor. He was not a scientist. He had not gone to college, had no advanced degrees, had spent his working life in a car rather than a classroom. But he had 14 years of human observation and a mind that was considerably sharper than most people assumed when they got his cab and started talking freely, and he was connecting things now with the quiet efficiency of a man who trusted his own intelligence even when he couldn't name what it was doing. He pulled over on a side street in Inman Park and sat with the engine running. He called Cheryl. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did during the day. "What's wrong?" she said immediately, because in 14 years he had never called her in the middle of the shift without a reason. "Nothing's wrong," he said. He stopped, started again. "You working today?" "Afternoon shift." "Why?" "Don't go in," he said. A pause. "Dennis, tell them you're sick. Tell them anything." He was looking out the windshield of the street that looked completely normal. A woman walking a dog. 2 men talking outside a barbershop. A delivery truck double parked with its hazards on. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it always was. "Just don't go in today." Another pause. Longer. "You heard the news," Cheryl said. It was not a question. "I heard it." "You think it's bad?" He thought about the quiet man from Tuesday evening. The dry throat that wasn't quite going away. The pharmacy line. Dr. Kim's eyes in the rear-view mirror. "I think it might be," he said quietly. "Yeah." Cheryl was silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted into the register she used when she had decided something. Calm, practical, the voice of a woman who did not panic, but who also did not pretend. It was one of the 10,000 things he loved about her. "I'll call the school," she said. "Get the kids early." "Good," he said. "Good." He sat for another moment after they hung up on the quiet side street in Inman Park, engine running, city going about its business around him. Then he reached into the back seat and found a small bottle of hand sanitizer he kept clipped to the headrest and used it thoroughly and carefully, the way he had not thought to do on Tuesday evening, when a quiet man with a bag had gotten out his cab on a midtown street and walked away without looking back. Too late for that now, but he used it anyway. In room 4 at Emory University Hospital, Adam Cross picked up his notepad and continued writing. The framework was taking shape. The anomalous immune response, the replication mechanism, the specific genomic sequence that Patel had flagged. He was building toward something. He could feel the way he always felt it when the data was beginning to resolve into a pattern, the sharp intellectual tension of a solution not yet visible but becoming inevitable. His temperature at 2 o'clock, 39.6. Unchanged. Holding, he wrote, and outside his window the trees showed their early spring green, and 2 floors below him in a ward that was filling faster than anyone had planned for. Sandra, the nurse on the 3rd floor of his building, was being moved into isolation with a fever of 38.9 and the beginning of bruising at her throat that a doctor she had never met was documenting with careful photographs and a growing sense of urgency. Atlanta was cracking, slowly, quietly, in the way that large things crack before they break. Not all at once, but in small failures that accumulate until the structure can no longer hold. The 2 o'clock press conference had bought perhaps 48 hours, maybe less. Chapter 9. Blood Work. The results arrived at 6:47 in the evening. Adam was sitting cross-legged on a hospital bed with a notepad on his knees and 3 pages of dense handwritten notes spread around him when his tablet lit up with a message from Patel. 2 words and an attachment. "Read this." He opened the attachment. It was 43 pages of hematological analysis, genomic sequencing data, and immunological profiling that Patel and the team had been building since morning. Adam read it the way he read everything important. Completely, without skipping, without jumping to conclusions, page by page, letting the data accumulate in the right order rather than reaching for the answer before he had earned it. It took him 22 minutes. When he finished, he set the tablet down on the bed and sat very still for a moment. Outside the window, the parking lot was lit by orange sodium lamps, and the trees beyond it had disappeared into the dark. Somewhere down the corridor, the monitoring equipment beeped its slow, steady rhythm. The ventilation moved its managed air in invisible currents around him. He picked the tablet back up and read the last 6 pages again. The anomaly in his immune response was not, as he had initially hypothesized, a simple variation in antibody production. It was more specific than that and more remarkable than that. And when he understood what it actually was, he sat with it for a long moment before allowing himself to believe it. His body was producing a protein, not an antibody in the conventional sense. Something adjacent to an antibody, something that shared structural characteristics with known neutralizing antibodies, but diverged at a critical point in a way that Patel had flagged in red with 3 question marks beside it because she had not seen it before either. A protein that appeared to be binding to the surface glycoproteins of the pathogen, the same glycoproteins that allowed the virus to enter and replicate within host cells, and interfering with that process, not stopping it, interfering with it, slowing the replication rate by a factor that Patel had calculated and then recalculated because the first result seemed too large to be correct. The second calculation confirmed the first. Adam's immune system was producing something that slowed the pathogen's replication by a factor of approximately 8 times slower than in an unprotected host. He thought about Luca the fisherman, dead on the 5th day. He thought about Daniel Marsh, 2 doors down, whose progression was following the Aquila timeline with the relentless consistency of a process that had not been slowed. He thought about Sandra, somewhere in this building now, at the beginning of that same timeline. 8 times slower meant that where Luca had died on day 5, Adam might have until day 40. 40 days was not survival. 40 days was not a cure. But 40 days was time, and time was the only currency that mattered right now, and he had more of it than anyone else in this building. He picked up the notepad. He began to write faster. Patricia came to the observation window at 8 o'clock. She looked tired in a way that her face did not usually show, a flatness around the eyes, a quality of controlled exhaustion that Adam recognized because he had seen in the mirror during the worst outbreaks of his career. He held his notepad to the glass before she could write anything. The protein. Did Patel explain it to you? Patricia nodded. She wrote on her pad. She briefed me an hour ago. Extraordinary. He wrote. It's the basis for a treatment. Possibly a vaccine. We need to synthesize it. She wrote. We know. Team already assembled. Patel is lead. He felt something that in another man might have been relief, but in Adam Cross manifested as a tightening of focus. The sensation of a problem that had seemed intractable suddenly revealing its first handhold. He wrote, How long for synthesis? Patricia looked at the question, looked at him, wrote slowly, Weeks, maybe more. He absorbed this, wrote, How many cases now? She held his gaze for a moment before writing the answer. When she turned the pad, he read it and felt the numbers settle in him with the weight of something that could not be unfelt. 247 confirmed. Grady at capacity. 3 other hospitals reporting clusters. 247. This morning there had been 19. He wrote, Dennis Washington. The driver. Have you found him? Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She wrote, He called U.S. this afternoon. He's home. Symptomatic. Adam closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Dennis Washington had called them himself, had put it together from the radio and whatever instinct 14 years of watching people had given him, and had called them and stayed home and called his wife and done everything right. And he was symptomatic anyway, because right and wrong had stopped matching the moment Adam Cross had walked through customs at Hartsfield-Jackson with temperature 38.7 and told himself it was nothing. He opened his eyes, wrote 1 word. Family? Patricia wrote, Wife and 2 grandchildren, all being evaluated. He looked at that for a long moment. Then he set the notepad down on his knees and looked at the wall and did something he had not done since he was a medical student 20 years ago, standing in a ward watching his first patient die. He let himself feel it, not the clinical registration of consequence, the epidemiological calculus of exposure and transmission and case fatality rate, not the professional acknowledgement of a situation developing along predictable lines, the actual human weight of it. Dennis Washington, who had talked about the Braves for 20 minutes and recommended a fried chicken place and had done absolutely nothing wrong, was sick in his house in whatever neighborhood he lived in, and his wife was being evaluated, and his grandchildren were being evaluated, and that was because of Adam. Directly, causally, unambiguously because of Adam. He sat with that for 90 seconds. Then he picked up the notepad and wrote, "I need direct access to Patel. Tablet call. I have thoughts on the synthesis pathway that won't wait." Patricia read it, looked at him, wrote, "Of course." Then she wrote something else more slowly and held it up. "Adam, the protein is yours. You found the way in. Remember that." He looked at it for a long moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his tablet and got back to work. 3 floors below room 4, in a ward that had been reorganized twice in the past 6 hours to accommodate the overflow, Sandra the nurse lay in a bed that was not so different from the beds she had made and changed and straightened for 8 years of her career. She had a fever of 39.1 and swollen lymph nodes and the beginning of bruising at her throat that she could feel more than see, a deep interior tenderness, like something pressed from the inside. She was frightened. She was also in the way of people who have spent years working in hospitals, practically frightened. Frightened in an organized way that left room for information and decisions alongside the fear. A doctor had explained the situation to her with careful honesty. Novel pathogen. Isolation protocol. A treatment being developed. Early stage, promising. She had asked the right questions because she knew which questions were right. She had understood the answers because she had the vocabulary for them. Then she had called her mother in Savannah and talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Her mother's garden, a show they both watched, a cousin's new baby, and had not mentioned the bruising or the fever or the ward she was lying in, because her mother was 73, and there was nothing her mother could do, and some information was not kindness. It was just wait. After the call, she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the elevator that morning. The man from the 7th floor. She didn't know his name, had seen him a handful of times in 8 months of living in the building, knew him only as quiet and early rising, and apparently some kind of scientist. They had ridden down together, and he had nodded, and she had nodded, and 30 seconds later, they had gone their separate ways into the morning. 30 seconds. She thought about all the patients she had seen today before she was pulled from the ward. Hands touched, temperatures taken, medications administered, the quiet physical intimacy of nursing that you stopped noticing after the first year, because if you noticed it every time, you would never be able to do the work. She thought about the treatment being developed. Early stage, promising. She turned those words over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what was underneath, testing their weight, their texture, whether they were solid or hollow. Promising. She decided to believe in promising. It was not naivety. She was not a naive person. It was a decision, made deliberately, the way you decided to keep working a 12-hour shift or decided to call your mother and talk about gardens. You chose what to do with the hours you had. She had always believed that. She believed it now. She closed her eyes. Down the corridor, Dennis Washington's name had just been added to the case list by a contact tracer who was working through a spreadsheet that had tripled in length since morning. His address in Vine City had been flagged, a public health officer dispatched, his wife and grandchildren scheduled for evaluation first thing tomorrow. In room 4, Adam Cross was on a tablet call with Patel, talking fast, his notepad covering equations and arrows and circled phrases, his temperature holding at 39.6 for the 4th consecutive reading, his protein doing in his blood what no drug had yet been designed to do. Outside, the hospital Atlanta was doing what cities do when they are frightened and do not yet fully understand why. Moving faster, talking louder, buying things they did not need, and calling people they had not called in months. Feeling without being able to name it the particular animal awareness of a herd that has caught a scent on the wind and has not yet decided which way to run. The 48 hours at the 2 o'clock press conference had bought were passing. By morning, Atlanta would know. Chapter 10. The City Wakes Up. The second press conference happened at 7 in the morning, and nobody had planned it that way. What happened was this. At 4:17 a.m., a nurse at Piedmont Hospital named Alicia Drummond posted a video on her private social media account. She had filmed it in a supply closet on her break, speaking quietly into her phone with the door closed, and she had intended it for her sister in Charlotte, who had been texting her anxious questions all evening. She had not intended it for anyone else. By 4:45, it had been shared 400 times. By 5:30, it had been viewed by 200,000 people and was being discussed on 3 national news networks simultaneously. Alicia Drummond had not said anything false. That was the thing that made it impossible to manage. She had described, accurately and without exaggeration, what she had seen in the past 12 hours. The cases coming in faster than the ward could process them. The bruising that the CDC bulletin had described appearing on patients who had not traveled anywhere near Congo, the atmosphere inside the hospital that she called controlled but scared, and that anyone who had ever worked in a hospital during a crisis would have recognized immediately as an accurate description. She had used the word airborne once, as a question rather than a statement. Nobody's telling us officially, but the way they're treating these cases, I think it might be airborne, and that single word, posed as a question by a tired nurse in a supply closet at 4 a.m, had done what 6 minutes of careful CDC language at 2 p.m. had failed to do. It had made Atlanta understand. Patricia Voss watched the video at 5:15 a.m. at her desk in the Emergency Operations Center, where she had not slept and did not intend to sleep. She watched it once, then again, then closed her laptop and called the director. "We need to go again," she said. 7 a.m., and this time we tell them everything. A pause on the line. "Patricia?" "Everything," she said. "Airborne transmission, confirmed cases, the containment strategy, what people should do. All of it." She looked at the wall of screens in front of her, each one showing a different data feed. Case counts, hospital capacity, contact tracing maps with their spreading clusters of red dots. Because if we don't tell them everything at 7 o'clock, they will have filled in the gaps themselves by 8, and what they fill it in with will be worse than the truth. Another pause. Longer. 7 o'clock. The director said. Dennis Washington watched the second press conference on his living room television wrapped in a blanket that Cheryl had put around his shoulders without asking, because she was that kind of woman, and he had married her for exactly that reason among 1,000 others. His fever was 38.9. His throat hurt. The lymph nodes under his jaw were swollen in a way that he kept touching with 2 fingers and then stopping himself from touching because touching them did not help, and he was trying to be calm. He was mostly calm. Cheryl sat beside him with her hand on his arm, and they watched the director of the CDC stand at his podium at 7 a.m. with the flags and the seal and the exhausted eyes of a man delivering news he had hoped to never deliver. And this time the words were different. This time there was no precautionary and no undue concern. This time there was airborne transmission confirmed, 143 cases across 6 Atlanta hospitals as of 6 a.m. this morning, a treatment in accelerated development, and a set of instructions for the residents of Atlanta that were clear and specific and left no room for the comfortable interpretation that everything was probably fine. Stay home if possible. Avoid crowded indoor spaces. If you develop fever, swollen lymph nodes, or unusual bruising, contact the health hotline immediately. Do not go to emergency rooms unless absolutely necessary. Use the hotline first. Dennis listened to all of it. When it was over, he looked at Cheryl. She looked at him. There was a whole conversation in that look. 14 years of shared language compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. And neither of them needed to say the part out loud that was frightening, because saying out loud would not make it less frightening. And they had grandchildren in the next room who did not need to hear it. "I'm going to make breakfast," Cheryl said. "Okay," Dennis said. She squeezed his arm and got up and went to the kitchen, and he heard her moving around in there, the sounds of his ordinary life continuing in the next room, and he pulled the blanket tighter and looked at the television where the press conference had ended, and the news anchors were talking very fast with the barely contained energy of people who had been waiting all night for exactly this. His phone was buzzing. His brother, his dispatcher, 3 friends from the cab company, a cousin in Marietta who had seen the video from the nurse. He set the phone face down on the cushion beside him. He would call them back. Later. Right now, He wanted to sit in his living room with the blanket Cheryl had put around him and listen to her moving around in the kitchen and be, for a few more minutes, simply at home. The city moved through the morning in stages. The first stage was disbelief, not denial exactly, but the natural human lag between receiving information and integrating it. People went through the motions of their routines with a slightly distracted air of those who were processing something large in the background. They made coffee. They checked their phones. They texted the same video to people who had already seen it. The second stage was action, the particular kind of action that fear produces when it is still organized enough to be purposeful. Grocery stores reported unusual traffic by 8 in the morning. Pharmacies sold out of fever reducers and hand sanitizer before 9. The health hotline that the CDC had set up received 40,000 calls in the first 2 hours, a volume that overwhelmed the system and produced a recorded message that itself became a source of anxiety for the people who heard it. Hardware stores reported a run on air purifiers and face masks. A sporting goods store in Buckhead sold 47 cases of bottled water before 10 o'clock. A woman in Decatur organized a neighborhood group chat in which she shared the CDC guidance accurately and calmly, and was largely ignored in favor of a thread about whether the water supply was safe, which it was, which did not stop the thread from continuing for the rest of the day. The third stage, the one that was just beginning at the edges of the city, in the neighborhoods where the cases were clustering most densely, in the hospitals where the staff had been working through the night, was something quieter and more serious than either disbelief or action. It was a stage where people stopped performing their response to the situation and simply lived inside it. At Georgia Tech, an apartment administrator named Louise Chin arrived at the office of Dr. Daniel Marsh's colleague at 8:15 with a list of names. She needed to know everyone Marsh had been in contact with in the 2 weeks before his hospitalization. Office hours, department meetings, shared lab spaces, casual conversations in corridors. His colleague, a man named Dr. Foster, who had known Marsh for 9 years and had eaten lunch with him the previous Friday, gave her the list with steady hands and a face that had gone carefully blank in the way of someone who has decided that blankness is the only appropriate response to what he is being told. When Louise left, he sat at his desk for a long time without doing anything. Then he called his wife. In room 4, Adam cross-read the case numbers on his tablet. 412 confirmed as of 8 a.m., a number that had nearly doubled overnight, and set the tablet down and looked at the ceiling. 412. He thought about the synthesis timeline. Weeks, Patricia had said. Maybe more. 412 cases, and weeks maybe more, and a replication rate that doubled the case count every few hours. And the mathematics of that were not something he needed to work out on paper, because he had spent his career reading exactly these kinds of numbers, and he knew what they meant without calculating them. He picked up the notepad. He had been working through the night on the synthesis pathway. The specific sequence of steps by which the protein his blood was producing might be isolated, replicated, and produced at scale. It was not his area of specialization. He was an epidemiologist, not a biochemist. But he understood the principles and he understood the data, and he had 11 years of working at the intersection of disciplines that did not always talk to each other, which meant he sometimes saw connections that specialists missed because specialists, by definition, looked deeply in one direction. He thought he could see a connection now. It was not certain. It was not even close to certain. It was a kind of idea that needed to be tested and validated and probably dismantled and rebuilt 3 times before it was worth anything. But it was there, in the notes on his pad, in the framework he had been constructing since Tuesday night in his apartment, when he had told himself it was just exhaustion and gone to bed. His temperature at 8 a.m., 39.4, down from 39.6. He read the number twice, made sure he had read it correctly. Then he wrote in the column of numbers in his notebook and looked at the column and allowed himself, for the first time since he had walked through customs at Hartsfield-Jackson, something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it. The protein was working. His body was doing something extraordinary, and if Patel could understand it fast enough and replicate at scale, and if the synthesis pathway held up under testing, and if the weeks became days, and maybe... He stopped himself there. Maybe was enough for now. He picked up the tablet and called Patel. She answered immediately, which told him she had not slept either. "I have something," he said, "on the synthesis pathway. I need you to look at pages 11 through 14 of my notes. I'm going to photograph them and send them now." "I'm looking at something too," Patel said. Her voice carried the controlled excitement that scientists developed as a professional defense against premature enthusiasm, flat on the surface, compressed underneath. "I think we might be looking at the same thing." Adam sat forward on the bed. "Tell me," he said. Outside room for the isolation unit went about its careful measured work, and beyond the hospital walls Atlanta was waking up to a morning that was unlike any morning it had known before, louder and quieter at the same time, full of movement and full of stillness, a city trying to find its footing on ground that had shifted in the night. Dennis Washington's granddaughter, 6 years old, came into the living room and climbed onto the couch beside him and put her head against his arm without saying anything, the way small children do when they understand that something is wrong without understanding what it is. He put his arm around her. Outside, the window-vine city was doing what it had always done, enduring, adapting, going on. It had been doing it for 100 years. Dennis Washington had been watching it do it his whole life. It would keep doing it. He had to believe that. Chapter 11. Walls. The quarantine order came at noon. Not for the whole city. Not yet. For a radius of 12 blocks around Grady Memorial Hospital, where the case density was highest, where the contact tracing maps showed the thickest concentration of red dots, where 3 of the city's first confirmed cases had lived within walking distance of each other without knowing it. 12 blocks. Approximately 40,000 residents. The National Guard had been on standby since Wednesday. They moved into position with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. Not this specifically, not Atlanta March with a novel filovirus, but something like this, the general shape of it, the logistics of closing a perimeter around a piece of city while the rest of the city watched. The rest of the city watched. Patricia Voss had fought the quarantine order for 6 hours. Not because she thought it was wrong. She understood the epidemiological logic, understood that the Grady cluster was the hottest zone, and that containing it bought time for the contact tracing to catch up with the spread. She understood all of that. What she had fought was the scope, the speed, and above all the optics of armed personnel establishing a perimeter around a predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta, a city whose relationship with that image had a history long enough and painful enough to make the public health calculus considerably more complicated than the people making the decision in Washington seemed to appreciate. She had said this, clearly and more than once, to people who had the authority to make the decision differently. They had made it the same way anyway. She stood at the window of the Emergency Operations Center and watched the deployment on the live feed, and felt the deep exhaustion of someone who's been right about something that happened regardless. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize. Georgia area code. She answered, "Dr. Voss." A woman's voice controlled, with an edge underneath control, that Patricia recognized immediately. "My name is Reverend Carol Simmons. I lead a congregation of 800 families in the affected zone. I need to talk to someone who is actually making decisions." Patricia looked at the live feed for a moment. Then she sat down. "I'm making decisions," she said. "Talk to me." Adam watched the quarantine deployment on his tablet with the focused attention of someone reading data rather than news. He was tracking 3 things simultaneously: the geographic spread of the case clusters relative to the quarantine boundary, the hospital capacity numbers that Patricia's team was updating every 2 hours, and the synthesis timeline that Patel had revised that morning after their call. The synthesis timeline had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to change the fundamental calculus of weeks versus days. But Patel had found something in the pathway that Adam's notes had pointed toward, a specific step in the protein isolation process that could be accelerated using an existing laboratory technique that nobody had thought to apply here, because nobody had seen this protein before, and therefore nobody had thought about how to replicate it. The revision was cautious. Patel was always cautious, which was one of the reasons Adam trusted her completely. She had written possible reduction of 30 to 40% in synthesis timeline, pending validation, and underlined pending validation twice, as if she knew he would want to move faster than the data justified. He did want to move faster. He also knew she was right to underline it. He set the tablet down and looked at the quarantine boundary on the map. 12 blocks, 40,000 people, a line drawn through a city that did not believe in lines until they were drawn through it. He thought about the protein, about the pathway, about the gap between possible and confirmed, and how many people would move through that gap in the time it took to close it. He picked up the notepad and kept working. Reverend Carol Simmons was 56 years old and had lived in the affected zone for 31 of those years. She had raised 3 children in it, buried her husband in the church she now led, watched the neighborhood change and be threatened and survive in the distinctly stubborn way of places that have been underestimated for so long that survival has become a kind of identity. She was not frightened of the virus in a way that people who had never faced serious adversity were frightened of it, with the shocked incomprehension of those encountering mortality as a real possibility for the first time. She had encountered mortality. She knew its texture. What she was frightened of was something more specific. She sat in her office in the church on Auburn Avenue with a window that looked out onto a street that now had a National Guard checkpoint at one end of it, and she made calls, systematic, organized calls, to the families in her congregation who were elderly and lived alone, to the ones who had compromised immune systems, to the ones who did not speak English well enough to understand the health hotline's automated instructions, to the ones who would not call a government number under any circumstances, because their experience of government numbers had not been the kind that encouraged trust. She made 31 calls in 2 hours. She kept notes. She built a list of what her people needed that the official response was not providing. Medication deliveries, translation, clear information about what the quarantine meant practically for people who could not simply stay home, because staying home meant their children did not eat. Then she called Patricia Voss. She had not expected Patricia to answer. She had not expected, if someone answered, to be talking within 30 seconds to someone who was actually listening rather than managing her. Patricia Voss was listening. "Tell me what you need," Patricia said. It was not a bureaucratic question. It was the question of someone who intended to do something with the answer. Reverend Simmons told her. Daniel Marsh had not spoken to anyone outside the isolation unit in 3 days. His family was in Boston, a sister, 2 nephews, parents in their 80s. He had called them once, the first day, and had said the things you said when you were in a situation like this, and did not want the people who loved you to understand the full dimensions of it. He had been calm and reassuring, and had answered their questions with the careful honesty of someone managing information rather than sharing it. After the call, he had not called again, not because he didn't want to. He wanted to, with an intensity that surprised him, the sudden acute awareness of distance that serious illness produced, but because each call required a performance of reassurance that cost more than he had to spend. He spent what he had on other things. His bruising had spread to his chest. The doctors showed him the progression charts without being asked because he had a medical background, and had made clear that he wanted information rather than comfort. He appreciated that. He studied the charts with the detached attention of scientists and felt, underneath the detachment, the thing that the detachment was there to manage. He knew about the protein. Patricia Voss had told him personally, had come to his observation window and written it out on her legal pad in large clear letters, the same way she communicated with Adam 2 doors down. Novel immune response in one of the other patients. Protein identified. Synthesis in progress. He had read it and nodded and written on his own pad. How long? And she had written, working on it, which was not an answer, but was also, he understood, the most honest thing she could say. He lay in his bed and looked at his ceiling, and thought about the northern tributary of the Congo River, where he had spent 3 weeks studying freshwater invertebrates, the cool brown water and the sounds of forest, and the absolute remove from everything he knew. He had loved it there with the pure, uncomplicated love of a scientist in his element. He had not known what was in the water. He had not known what was in the air of the village where he had stopped to help, because it seemed like the right thing to do. He still believed it had been the right thing to do. He was trying, in the long hours of room 2, to hold on to that. At 4 in the afternoon, a 14-year-old boy named Marcus Webb. No relation to any of the characters in this story. Just a boy who lived with his grandmother on Hilliard Street, inside the quarantine zone. Discovered that the basketball court 2 blocks from his house was empty. It was always busy after school. Every day for the 3 years since he had been tall enough to play with the older kids, it had been busy. Voices, the rhythm of the ball, the raw competitive pleasure of space that belonged to everyone and therefore to him. Today it was empty. He stood at the edge of the court with his ball under his arm and looked at the empty space and felt something that he didn't have a word for yet. Something that adults called dread, but that at 14 felt more like the wrongness of a familiar thing seen from an unfamiliar angle. He bounced the ball once. The sound of it came back to him from the chain-link fence and the empty concrete and the quiet street beyond. He bounced again. Then he started playing, by himself, methodically, running the drills his coach had taught him. Layups, free throws, the three-point arc, back and forth across the empty court with the focused, solitary energy of someone who has decided that doing a thing is better than standing at the edge of it. After 20 minutes, a boy from his building came and joined him without saying anything. Then another. By 5 o'clock, there were 7 of them on the court, playing in the shadow of the quarantine perimeter. The sound of the ball and their voices rising into the late afternoon air of a neighborhood that was frightened and contained and stubbornly, persistently alive. In room 4, Adam Cross put down his notepad at 6 in the evening and looked at his hands. They were steady. His temperature at 6 p.m., 39.1, still falling. He looked at the number for a long moment. Then he wrote it in the column alongside all the others. The slow, descending line of a fever that was losing ground to something in his blood that had no name yet, but was doing its work regardless. He thought about Marcus Webb on the basketball court, though he did not know Marcus Webb existed. He thought about Dennis Washington's granddaughter with her head against his arm. He thought about Reverend Simmons making 31 phone calls in 2 hours. He thought about Sandra choosing to believe in promising. He thought about all the people in this city who were not scientists, who did not have anomalous immune responses, who did not understand the synthesis pathway or the genomic sequencing or the replication mechanism, who had nothing but themselves and each other, and the stubborn, unreasonable determination to keep going. He picked up the notepad and worked until midnight, the city dark and quiet outside his window. Chapter 12. The Offer. The man from Washington arrived on Friday morning. Adam knew he was coming before he arrived because Patricia had warned him through the glass the previous evening with 3 words on her legal pad. Someone coming tomorrow. And then, after a pause in which she had seemed to be deciding how much to write, be careful. He had not slept well. The man's name was Garrett. He did not offer a last name or an institutional affiliation, which told Adam everything he needed to know about the institutional affiliation. He was in his late 40s, trim, with a trained stillness that Adam associated with people who had been trained to be unreadable and had practiced it long enough that it had become their actual personality. He stood on the other side of the observation window in full PP and spoke through the intercom of the isolation unit used for exactly this kind of communication, his voice arriving slightly flattened by the speaker, stripped of some of its texture, which Adam suspected Garrett did not mind at all. "Dr. Cross," he said, "I want to start by saying that what you've done here, the identification of the protein, the work on the synthesis pathway, is genuinely remarkable. You should know that." Adam said nothing. He had decided before Garrett arrived that he would listen completely before responding to anything. The situation outside is developing faster than the containment measures can manage, Garrett continued. I think you know that. As of this morning, we have 940 confirmed cases across 11 hospitals. The quarantine zone is holding, but the spread outside is accelerating. He paused. We need the treatment faster than the current synthesis timeline allows. Patel's team is moving as fast as the science permits, Adam said. You can't accelerate validation. If you skip steps, you get a treatment that doesn't work or actively causes harm. That's not a faster solution. It's a different problem. Garrett nodded slowly. I understand that. That's not what I'm proposing. Adam waited. Your blood, Garrett said, the protein your immune system is producing. We want to use it directly. Extracted plasma, administered to critical cases while the synthetic version is being developed. It's been done before with other pathogens. Convalescent plasma therapy. Adam knew about convalescent plasma therapy. He had seen it used. He also knew its limitations, the volume constraints, the compatibility issues, the fact that one person's blood, however remarkable its properties, was not a scalable solution to a city of 2 million people. How many critical cases are we talking about? He said. Currently 47. People who will not survive the week without intervention. Garrett held his gaze through the glass and through the PP with the steady focus of someone delivering a number they know will land with weight, possibly more by the time we finish this conversation. 47. Adam thought about Luca the fisherman. He thought about Daniel Marsh 2 doors away. He thought about Sander downstairs in Dennis, Washington in Vine City, and the 45 other people he had never met who were running out of time at a rate that the synthesis timeline could not match. What exactly are you proposing? He said. Plasmapheresis, Garrett said. We extract the plasma, process it, administer it to critical patients. The procedure is safe and well established. You would remain here in isolation throughout. It would not interfere with your recovery or with Patel's work on the synthetic version. And if my body can't produce enough, if the extraction affects my own immune response at a critical point in my recovery, those are risks we would monitor closely, and those are risks I would be taking, Adam said. Not you. Garrett was quiet for a moment. To his credit, he did not pretend the distinction was not real. Yes, he said, they are risks you will be taking. Adam stood at the window and looked at the man from Washington whose last name he did not know and thought about 47 people and thought about the protein moving through his blood and thought about the difference between a risk you choose and a risk you impose on others without their knowledge, which was a difference he understood better than he ever had before. I want 3 things, Adam said. Garrett waited. Patel oversees the extraction process personally, not a team assigned by whoever you work for. Patel. He held up 2 fingers. The plasma goes to the most critical cases first, prioritized by medical need, not by any other criteria. Medical need only. He held up a 3rd finger. Full transparency with Patricia Voss at every step. She sees everything. Garrett considered this for approximately 4 seconds. Agreed, he said. It was the speed of the agreement that told Adam the man had come prepared to agree to these terms, or terms very much like them, that the negotiation had been, in some sense, performed rather than real. He filed this away without reacting to it. One more thing, Adam said. Garrett waited again. Dennis Washington, the cab driver. Whatever resources you have access to, and I think you have access to considerable resources, I want him receiving the best available care immediately, not standard protocol. The best. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Garrett's expression. Not surprised exactly. Something closer to recalibration. I'll make a call, he said. Make it before you leave the building, Adam said. Patricia came to the window an hour after Garrett left. She did not write anything on her legal pad. She just looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something that was not quite pride and not quite worry, and was probably both simultaneously. The expression of someone watching another person do something difficult in the right way. He held up his notepad. Did I just make a deal with someone I shouldn't have made a deal with? She looked at it for a long moment. Then she wrote on her pad and held it up. Probably, but the 47 needed you too. He looked at that for a moment. Then he wrote. Dennis? She wrote. Garrett made the call before he left the building. Adam lowered the notepad. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and beyond at the parking lot and beyond at the trees, showing their spring green in the Friday morning light, and thought about 47 people who did not know his name receiving something from his blood had made, without being asked to, in the same automatic, faithful way that bodies do their work regardless of whether the person they belong to deserves it. He thought he probably did not deserve it. He thought he was going to try anyway. The first plasma extraction happened that afternoon. Patel oversaw it personally, as agreed, with the focused attention of someone who understood that the thing she was watching was not only a medical procedure, but a variable in an experiment that had consequences she could not fully calculate. She documented everything. She asked questions. She pushed back twice on procedural details and was right both times, which Adam had expected. The procedure took 2 hours. Adam lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the strange intimacy of having something taken from him for the specific purpose of giving it to someone else, a transaction that had no market value, no contract, no reciprocity except the abstract and sufficient reciprocity of one human body helping another. When it was over, he felt tired in a way that was different from the fever fatigue, a cleaner tiredness, more specific, the tiredness of something expended rather than something fought. His temperature at 4 p.m., 38.8, still falling. He wrote the number in his column and looked at the line of descending numbers and thought about the 47 and thought about the synthesis timeline and thought about the framework in his notepad that was becoming, slowly and with the grinding patience that real science required, something that looked like it might work. Might. He was getting more comfortable with might. Outside room for the isolation unit continued its careful work. Outside the hospital Atlanta continued its frightened and stubborn and complicated life. The quarantine zone held. The case count climbed. The contact tracing teams worked through their lists with a methodical urgency of people racing a clock they could not see. In Vine City, Dennis, Washington's fever broke at 4:47 in the afternoon. He didn't know yet what had happened, what had been decided in a room he had never been in, by a man he had never met, because of a quiet fare on a Tuesday evening who had tipped adequately and not looked back. He just knew that the heat was gone. He called Cheryl into the room and told her, and she sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand, and they stayed like that for a while, without saying anything, because some things did not need words, and this was one of them. Chapter 13. Breaking Point. The riot started on Saturday, not in the quarantine zone. Inside the quarantine zone, it was quiet in the way that places under pressure are quiet, a hell-breath silence full of people managing their fear with the disciplined practicality of those who have no alternative. The people inside the zone had Reverend Simmons and her network of 31 calls, and the food deliveries that Patricia had organized after a conversation with her, and the deep resilience of a neighborhood that had been managing without adequate support for long enough that managing without adequate support had become a skill. The riot started outside the quarantine zone. They started, as these things often do, not from a worse impulse, but from a legitimate one that had nowhere constructive to go. A crowd outside the Buckhead quarantine checkpoint. People who had family inside the zone. People who wanted information that the official channels were not providing fast enough. People who were frightened in a specific way that comes from watching something happen to people you love through a barrier you cannot cross. The crowd had been there since morning. It had been peaceful through the afternoon. At 6 in the evening, someone threw something. Nobody was ever certain who or why. The kind of originating act that gets lost in the noise of what follows. And the checkpoint response was faster and harder than it needed to be, and within 20 minutes the crowd had transformed into something with different physics, different rules, a different relationship to barriers in front of it. By 8 o'clock, there were 3 separate incidents across the city. By 10, there were 7. Patricia watched the feeds from the Emergency Operations Center with the steady attention of someone cataloging information they cannot act on fast enough. She made calls. She pushed for de-escalation. She argued against the response posture that was making things worse, and was right, and was partially ignored in the way she had become accustomed to being partially ignored by people who confuse authority with correctness. She did not stop making the calls. Adam watched the feeds on his tablet. He had been awake since 4 in the morning, not from the fever, which had continued its slow retreat, but from a familiar insomnia of someone whose mind will not stop working on a problem that is almost but not quite solved. He had filled 4 more pages of his notepad in the dark, working by the light of the tablet screen, following the thread of the synthesis pathway into a section of the process that Patel had flagged as the most technically demanding and that Adam had been circling for 2 days looking for the angle of approach that made it tractable. He thought he had found it at 3 a.m. He had sent Patel a message immediately, which she had responded to 11 minutes later, which told him she was also awake at 3 in the morning, which surprised him not at all. Her response was 2 sentences. I see it. Give me 6 hours. He had given her 6 hours. He had watched the riot feeds and worked on a notepad and taken his temperature every 2 hours and watched the numbers fall with the slow, reliable consistency of something that was actually happening rather than something he was hoping would happen. 6 a.m., 38.6. 8 a.m., 38.3. 10 a.m., 38.1. Below 38 was a threshold. Below 38 his body would no longer technically be febrile. Below 38 was a word he had not allowed himself to use yet. He watched the fires on the tablet screen. Small ones contained nothing like what they looked like on the news feeds that were running the footage on continuous loops with the breathless energy of outlets that had been waiting for images to match the story they were telling. He watched them and thought about the 47 and the plasma and Patel's 6 hours and the framework in his notepad. He thought about the city out there doing the terrible human thing of breaking under pressure in some places while holding together in others simultaneously, the way cities always did, the way people always did, not uniformly brave or uniformly frightened, but both at once, in different proportions in different people at different moments. His phone. Patricia had given it back 2 days ago, a quiet acknowledgement of a changed situation. Showed him the news feeds and the case numbers and a message from Garrett that said only plasma recipients responding, and which Adam read 3 times to make sure he had read it correctly. Responding, not recovered, not cured. Responding. The careful clinical word for a body that has received something and is doing something useful with it. The first tentative evidence that what his blood contained was not just remarkable in him but transferable, replicable in its effects if not yet in its production. He set the phone down and picked up the notepad. Patel called at noon. The synthesis pathway, she said. Her voice had the flat control quality of 6 hours ago, but something had changed underneath it. A compression that Adam recognized as the thing she did when she was about to say something she'd checked enough times to believe. Tell me, he said. The approach you identified at 3 a.m., the alternative entry point in the isolation sequence. A pause. It works. I've run it 4 times. It's not a shortcut. It doesn't compromise the integrity of the protein, but it eliminates 2 steps in the purification process that were accounting for approximately 40% of the timeline. Adam sat very still. 40%, he said. 40%, she confirmed. Which means instead of weeks we're looking at, another pause, the pause of someone being precise rather than dramatic. 8 to 10 days for the first viable batch. Possibly 7 if the scaling goes cleanly. 7 days. He looked at the case numbers on his tablet. 1,412 confirmed as of this morning. A curve that was still climbing, but climbing differently than it had been. Not the vertical acceleration of an unchecked spread, but something with more friction in it. The quarantine and the contact tracing and the public behavior. Changes beginning to show up in the data as a gradual flattening that was not yet a plateau, but was a shape that preceded one. 7 days was not nothing. 7 days was, in fact, everything. Patel, he said. Yes. Good work. A silence. Then, it was your entry point. It was your 4 runs at 3 in the morning, he said. Go sleep for 4 hours. That's an order. You can't give me orders, you're a patient. I'm giving them anyway. He heard something that might have been the closest Patel ever came to a laugh. Then she ended the call. Adam stood up. He had not stood without immediately sitting back down in 4 days. He stood now and felt the uncertain quality of legs that had been horizontal too long, the slight unreality of vertical, and waited for it to pass. It passed. He walked to the window, 6 steps, the full navigable distance of room 4, and stood looking out at the parking lot and the trees beyond it. The trees were fuller than they had been when he arrived. A week of March warmth had done what March warmth does: pushed the green further out along the branches, filled in the spaces, committed to the season in a way that the first tentative buds had not quite done. He stood at the window for a long time. He thought about Aquila, the smell of it, the heat, the sound of the child crying in the building with the corrugated roof, the man on the floor with the bruising spreading across his throat, Bosco in his yellow apron and his oversized gloves, who had stayed when nobody came. He thought about what he had carried home from that place without knowing it. The virus, yes, but also something else, the image of Bosco staying, of the woman with her hand on the child's chest, of 41 people in a village with no name on most maps who had died before anyone arrived to help them. He thought about what his body had done with the virus that had been given without consent, had fought it, had found a way through it, had produced something in the fighting that might now save people it had never met in a city on the other side of the world from where the fighting had begun. He did not think this meant he was forgiven. He did not think it was about forgiveness. He thought it was about the fact that the body keeps doing its work regardless, keeps fighting, keeps producing, keeps finding the pathway through, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is get out of the way and let it. His temperature at noon, 37.9, below 38. He stood at the window and let himself use the word he had been withholding: recovery. In the city outside the hospital, the Saturday was doing what Saturdays do in a city under pressure, containing multitudes. The fires from the previous night had been contained, the checkpoints held. In the quarantine zone, Reverend Simmons was organizing a distribution of food and medication with the methodical grace of someone who had been doing this kind of work her whole life and had simply redirected it toward a new emergency. Marcus Webb was on the basketball court again. More kids this time, 12 of them, a full run, the sound of it carrying down the block in the Saturday afternoon air. Dennis Washington sat on his front porch in Vine City for the first time in 4 days, wrapped in a jacket despite the warmth because Cheryl had insisted, watching the street. His fever had been gone for 24 hours. His lymph nodes were still tender. The bruising at his throat was fading. Not gone, but fading. The dark spreading ink of it retreating back towards origin with the slow reliability of something that had been beaten. He was watching the street the way he always watched it, with the 14-year attention of a man who knew every face and every rhythm of his neighborhood and noticed when something was different. What was different today was harder to name than the pharmacy line or the canceled fare or Dr. Kim's eyes in the rearview mirror. It was something in the quality of the quiet, not the hell-breath quiet of the past 4 days. Something else, something that had given it. He sat on his porch and breathed the Saturday air and watched the street, and after a while his granddaughter came out and sat on the step below him and leaned back against his legs the way she always did, and he put his hand on the top of her head, and they sat like that together watching the neighborhood. Down the block someone had a radio on, something with a good beat, something that had no business being played on a day like this, and was being played anyway, which Dennis Washington thought was just about right. Just about exactly right. Chapter 14. What Remains. Adam was discharged from room 4 on a Tuesday morning. Not discharged into the world. Discharged into a different kind of containment, a monitored apartment on the CDC campus, where he would remain under observation for another 14 days while his blood work was tracked and the plasma extractions continued on a reduced schedule, and the synthesis team worked through the final validation runs on the treatment that was, as of Monday evening, showing a 91% efficacy rate in the first control trials. 91%. Patel had sent him a number at 11 p.m. with no commentary, which was the most expressive thing she had ever communicated to him. He had sat with it for a long time before sleeping. The discharge process was administrative and medical and unexpectedly ceremonial in a way that Adam had not anticipated and did not know how to receive. Torres, the nurse who had processed his admission 9 days ago, processed his discharge with the same brisk, impersonal efficiency, and then paused at the door of room 4 and said simply good luck. Dr. Cross in a tone that carried more weight than words, and Adam said thank you and meant in a way He was not accustomed to meaning things. He stood in the doorway of room 4 for a moment before leaving. 9 days. The trees outside the window were fully green now, committed entirely to spring. No trace of the tentative budding he had watched from the bed. The parking lot looked the same. The strip of sky above the tree line was the same narrow white. Everything the same. Nothing the same. He walked out. Patricia met him in the corridor outside the isolation unit. She was not in PPE. The first time he had seen her face in 9 days without glass between them. She looked tired in a way that sleep would not immediately fix. The accumulated tiredness of 10 days of sustained crisis management that had aged her in some fine and specific way around the eyes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something he had never seen her do in 11 years. She put her hand briefly on his arm. Not a hug, not an embrace, nothing that Patricia Voss would have called an emotional gesture. Just her hand on his arm for approximately 3 seconds. "Welcome back," she said. He did not trust himself to say anything that would be adequate. So he said nothing, and she understood that, and they walked down the corridor together toward whatever came next. What came next was a debrief that lasted 4 hours. Adam sat at a conference table in a building on the CDC campus with Patricia and 6 other people whose roles in the past 10 days he had been tracking from room 4 through tablet screens and legal pad messages. And they went through everything, the timeline, the decisions, the things that had worked and the things that had not, the gaps in the response that had allowed the spread to accelerate before containment caught up with it, the things that would need to be different next time. There would be a next time. There was always a next time. That was a foundational premise of the work. Not that you would prevent every outbreak, but that you would learn from each one enough to handle the next one better. Adam spoke for 2 hours of the 4. He was precise and thorough and did not spare himself in the accounting of what he had done and not done in the 36 hours between landing at Hartsfield-Jackson and telling Patricia the truth in the laboratory. He laid it out with the same clinical detachment. He applied to everything and felt, underneath the detachment, the same thing he felt looking out the window of room 4 at the fully green trees. Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Something more durable than either. Accountability. The specific relief of having said the true thing completely and having it received by people who were going to do something useful with it. When he finished, there was a silence around the table. That was not uncomfortable. Then one of the 6 people, a woman from the response team named Dr. Okafor, whom Adam had not met before this morning, said, "The plasma recipients, all 47, are stable as of this morning." Adam looked at her. "All 47, she said again, as if she understood he needed to hear it twice. He nodded once, looked at the table, nodded again. Daniel Marsh was still in room 2. His progression had slowed significantly after the plasma treatment. The bruising had stopped advancing. His fever had dropped. His body was doing something with what Adam's blood had given it that the doctors were tracking with careful optimism. He was not out of danger. He was, as one of his doctors put it, trending in the right direction, which was the medical version of promising and carried the same weight. Adam asked to see him. It took 2 days to arrange. The protocols, the PPE requirements, the careful choreography of 2 people in a still active isolation unit, navigating the space between them. But on Thursday morning, Adam stood at the observation window of room 2 and looked at Daniel Marsh for the first time. Marsh was sitting up in bed. He was thinner than his Georgia Tech faculty photo. Adam had looked it up, and the bruising at his throat had faded to a yellowish shadow, the color of something that had been and was becoming something else. He looked like a man who had been through something and knew it, and was still in the process of understanding what it meant. He looked at Adam through the glass. Neither of them had a legal pad. Neither of them had prepared anything to say. They stood on opposite sides of the window, in the sealed air of the isolation unit, and looked at each other for a long moment. Then Marsh raised his hand. Not a wave exactly, an acknowledgement, the specific gesture of one person recognizing another across a distance that cannot currently be closed. Adam raised his hand in return. They stayed like that for a moment. Then Adam nodded once and walked back down the corridor, and Marsh watched him go, and then looked back at his window and the parking lot and the trees that were fully green now, the same trees Adam had watched from a different window, the same spring committing to itself outside the glass, the treatment designated AZ, one in the clinical shorthand that would follow it to the approval process. Atlanta Ground Zero, a name that Patel had chosen with the quiet deliberateness of someone who understood that names carry history, completed its final validation run on Friday. 93% efficacy across the trial group. Adverse events minimal and manageable. Synthesis scaling to production volume within 72 hours. Patel sent Adam the results at 7 in the morning with the same absence of commentary as before. He read them in the monitored apartment on the CDC campus, sitting at the desk with his coffee, in the ordinary morning light of Friday in late March that looked like any other Friday in late March except that it wasn't. He read the results 3 times. Then he opened a new document on his laptop and began writing the incident report that would go into the permanent record. The full account, from Aquila to the airport to the laboratory to room 4, everything he had seen and done and failed to do and done anyway, the complete and unsparing version that would sit in the CDC archive and be read by people he would never meet who were preparing for the thing that came after this. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping. When he finished, he read it through once, made 2 corrections, and submitted it. Then he sat back and looked out the window of the monitored apartment at the CDC campus in the Friday morning light. The buildings he had worked in for 11 years, the quad, the people crossing it with the purposeful energy of people who had work to do and were doing it. His temperature, 36.8. Normal. He sat with that for a moment. The column of numbers in his notebook ended here. A descending line from 38.7 at Hartsfield-Jackson to 36.8 on a Friday morning in late March. 10 days of his body doing the thing bodies do when they are given enough time and the right conditions and something in the blood that knows how to fight. He closed the notebook. He thought about Bosco in his yellow apron. He thought about the community hall and Aquila and the man on the floor and the woman in the corner and the 41 people who had not had the time or the conditions or whatever it was his blood contained that theirs had not. He thought about them for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Patricia. She answered on the first ring. "I want to go back," he said. A silence. To Aquila? To Aquila. Bosco is still there. The village needs a full epidemiological assessment, proper medical support, documentation of the original outbreak that nobody did properly because nobody came when he called. He paused. "I should go." Another silence. Longer. "Adam," Patricia said, "you're technically still a patient. I know. You're supposed to be under observation for another 11 days. I know." The silence on the line had a quality he recognized. The silence of Patricia Voss doing the calculations she always did, weighing the thing that was correct against the thing that was right and finding, as she sometimes did, that they were not the same thing. 2 weeks, she said finally, "when you're fully cleared. We send a proper team, and you lead it." 2 weeks, he agreed. "And Adam..." "Yes." "Write the paper first. The protein, the synthesis pathway, the immune response. All of it, Patel will co-author." A pause. "The world needs to know what your body did. Not just the treatment, the mechanism, the whole thing." He looked out the window at the Friday morning campus. "I'll write it," he said. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the plain light of a Friday that was not ordinary at all. And then he opened a new document and began. Chapter 15. The City Breathes. The quarantine lifted on a Wednesday, not all at once. In stages, the way it had been imposed, with the careful incrementalism of people who understood that a city is not a light switch. The innermost zone first, the Grady cluster, where the case density had peaked and then fallen with the slow relief of a fever breaking. Then the outer rings, checkpoint by checkpoint. Over the course of 4 days that felt simultaneously like 4 years and 4 hours depending on who you were and where you had been standing when the barriers went up. The day the Hilliard Street checkpoint came down, Reverend Carol Simmons was there. She had not planned to be. She had been on her way to deliver medication to an elderly parishioner on the other side of the checkpoint. The same errand she had been making every other day for 2 weeks, navigating the paperwork and the protocols with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made the system work for her people by learning its language and speaking it back. She had arrived at the checkpoint at 8 in the morning to find the barriers being dismantled by 2 National Guard personnel who worked with the matter-of-fact efficiency of people reassembling rather than deploying, putting things away rather than putting them up. She stood and watched them work. Around her, the street was doing what streets do when barriers come down, filling, slowly at first, and then with gathering confidence. People emerging from the enclosed interior life that containment produces and relearning the ordinary act of moving through shared space. An elderly man with a cane, a woman with 2 grocery bags, 3 teenagers on bikes who had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment and were now making the most of it with the specific joy of the newly uncontained. Reverend Simmons watched them and felt something she had been managing carefully for 2 weeks release itself without permission. She stood on Hilliard Street and cried for approximately 90 seconds. Then she wiped her face, picked up the medication bag, and continued to her parishioner's house. Sandra was discharged from Emory on a Thursday. She walked out of the hospital into the late March morning with the slightly dazed quality of someone returning to a world that had continued without them and was surprised to find it mostly the same. The same street, the same sounds, the same air, which felt different from the managed air of the isolation unit in a way that was difficult to describe but immediately apparent. Less controlled, more complicated, full of things that had not been filtered out. She stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital entrance and breathed it. A colleague from the ward, a nurse named Priya, who had not been infected, who had been working the expanded isolation protocols for 2 weeks with the grim dedication of someone holding a line, had come to meet her. They had not been close before this. They were close now in the way that people become close when they have been through something large in proximity to each other, a closeness that did not require history, because it had its own. Priya handed her a coffee without saying anything. Sandra took it, and they stood together on the sidewalk and drank their coffee in the Thursday morning light, and did not talk about any of it, because there would be time to talk about it, and right now standing outside in the air with a coffee was enough. It was, in fact, everything. Later, Sandra would go back to work. She would return to the ward that had been reorganized twice during the outbreak, and was being reorganized again now, reconfiguring itself back towards something closer to ordinary. She would care for patients with the same hands that had cared for patients before, the same automatic intimate attention of someone for whom this was not a job in a way that jobs are things you do for a defined number of hours and then stop. She would think about the 30 seconds in the elevator every day for a long time. She had decided, in the long hours of her own room, not room for a different room, but with the same filtered air and the same ceiling and the same window onto the same parking lot, that the 30 seconds were not the point. The point was not the exposure or the infection, or the 10 days of fever and bruising and careful optimism. The point was what you did with what remained when it was over. She was still deciding what that was. She had time to decide. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had time. Dennis Washington did not go back to driving immediately. Cheryl told him 2 weeks minimum, and he did not argue because Cheryl was right about most things, and about this she was certainly right. He was stronger every day. The fever long gone. The bruising faded to nothing. The lymph nodes returning to their ordinary, unnoticed size. But strength was not the same as ready, and he knew the difference. He spent the 2 weeks doing things he had been meaning to do for years and had not done because it was always another shift, always another fare, always a comfortable deferral of a man whose life was organized around motion. He fixed the back fence that had needed fixing since October. He cooked meals that required more than 30 minutes. He sat on the porch in the mornings with his coffee and watched Vine City reassemble itself after the quarantine with the same attention he brought to watching it from the cab. The same faces, the same rhythms, the texture of a neighborhood returning to itself. His granddaughter Maya had decided, in the way of 6-year-olds, that his recovery was largely her personal achievement. She had brought him water every hour during the fever days with the focused dedication of someone performing an important medical function. She now reported to anyone who would listen that her grandfather had been very sick, and she had helped fix him, which was not entirely inaccurate, and which Dennis did not correct. On the first Monday after the quarantine lifted, he drove her to school. Not in the cab. In his own car, the 10-year-old Civic that Cheryl drove during the week. He drove Maya to school and walked to the door and watched her go inside, and then sat in the car for a moment in the school drop-off zone with the engine running. He thought about the Tuesday evening fare. The quiet man with the bag who had tipped adequately and not looked back. He had learned the man's name from a news coverage, Dr. Adam Cross, CDC, and had followed the story with the close attention of someone who has a personal stake in an outcome. He had read about the protein and the treatment and the 93% efficacy, and had understood maybe 60% of it, and understood the rest in the way you understand things that have happened to your own body. He did not feel anger toward Adam Cross. He had examined that question carefully during the long days of the fever, turning it over in the way you turn difficult things over when you have nothing but time and the interior of your own thinking. He had found, at the bottom of it, something that was not anger and was not forgiveness, because forgiveness implied a transaction, and this did not feel like a transaction. It felt like something that had happened, a chain of events that had moved through the world and through him, and had come out the other side into a Thursday morning where his granddaughter was going to school, and he was sitting in his car in the drop-off zone with the engine running. He pulled out of the drop-off zone and drove. Not to the cab lot, just through the neighborhood. Through the streets, he knew the way he knew his own hands. Past the pharmacy that had a normal line now, and the basketball court where kids were already gathering before school, and the barber shop where the two men had been talking outside on the morning everything started. He drove through Vine City and then through the neighborhoods beyond it, and then, without having planned to, onto the highway. And for 20 minutes he drove through Atlanta in the late morning light with no fare and no destination and no particular purpose except the driving itself, which had always been enough. The city moved around him. It was the same city. Of course it was the same city. But it had the quality that places have after something large has moved through them. Not damaged exactly, not unmarked, but somehow more legible than before, as if the pressure of the past 2 weeks had clarified something in its surfaces that had always been there but had not been visible. Dennis Washington drove through a city and looked at it, and thought it was still the most complicated thing he had ever loved. He turned the radio on. Marcus Webb's team won the Saturday game. It was not an official game. There were no official games yet. The school leagues were still reorganizing after the disruption of the outbreak, but it was real in a way that mattered, which was that both sides were playing hard and keeping score, and the result at the end was definitive. Marcus had scored 14 points. He had not been sick. None of the kids on the court had been sick, which was a fact that Marcus understood in the abstract. He had heard the adults talk about children being less vulnerable, had seen the statistics on his phone, but which he experienced less as statistical relief than as a simple continuing fact of his life, which had been interrupted and was now uninterrupted, and was moving forward in the way lives do when they are allowed to. After the game, he sat on the bleachers with two friends, and they talked about the things 14-year-olds talk about when the immediate crisis has passed, and the familiar future has reasserted itself. School Music, a movie that had come out during the quarantine that they were all going to see next weekend. Normal things. Aggressively, beautifully, entirely normal things. One of his friends said something funny, and Marcus laughed. The full, unguarded laugh of someone who has temporarily forgotten everything except the thing that is funny, and the sound of it went out across the empty court and the chain-link fence and the Hilliard Street that had a checkpoint at one end of it 2 weeks ago, and had nothing there now except the street itself, continuing in both directions the way streets do, open, available, going somewhere. In the monitored apartment on the CDC campus, Adam Cross finished the first draft of the paper at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. 43 pages. The protein, the mechanism, the synthesis pathway, the clinical outcomes. Patel's name first. He had insisted on that, and she had resisted, and he had insisted again, and she had accepted with the quiet grace of someone who has been given something they deserve and are not accustomed to receiving. He read through the draft once, made notes in the margins, closed the laptop. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the apartment. The CDC campus at night, the deep silence of institutional buildings after hours, familiar and specific and his. He thought about Aikila. 2 weeks until he could go. 14 days of monitoring and blood work and the final clearance protocols that stood between him and a motorboat on a brown river 3 hours from the nearest town. He had already been in contact with Bosco. A brief exchange through the WHO field office, logistical, practical, making arrangements. Bosco had added one line at the end of his message that was not logistical or practical. "We are still here," he had written. "Come back." Adam had read it and set his phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He was going back, not to fix what had happened. Some things did not get fixed, they got carried. And he was learning the difference between the two, not to earn something or discharge a debt that could not be discharged, but because Bosco was still there, and the village was still there, and the work was still there, and the work was the thing that remained when everything else had been said and accounted for. It had always been the thing that remained. He turned off the light. Outside the window, the CDC campus was quiet, and the city beyond it was quiet, and somewhere in Vine City, Dennis, Washington, was asleep with his temperature normal, and his granddaughter in the next room and Cheryl beside him, and somewhere in Virginia Highland, Daniel Marsh was reading in his apartment. Discharged 3 days ago, thinner than before and alive, and somewhere on Auburn Avenue, Reverend Simmons was preparing Sunday's sermon, and somewhere in the East Atlanta neighborhood Sandra was on the phone with her mother talking about a cousin's new baby and her mother's garden, and a show they both watched, and Marcus Webb was asleep, dreaming whatever 14-year-olds dream when the day has been good. Atlanta was breathing, quietly, imperfectly, with the full, complicated human texture of a city that had been through something and was still itself on the other side of it. Still itself. Adam Cross turned off the light and went to sleep, and outside his window the spring night held the city in its ordinary darkness and did not let go. Chapter 16. Ground Zero. 3 weeks after his discharge from Room 4, Dr. Adam Cross stood on the bank of the Congo River and watched the brown water move. The motorboat that had brought him from the nearest town was tied to a stake in the mud behind him. The 2-person team from the WHO field office in Kinshasa was unloading equipment with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. The forest wall rose around them, green and absolute, swallowing sound the way it always had. The heat was the same. The smell of the river was the same. Everything was the same, and he was not the same, and that was the correct order of things. Bosco was waiting for him at the edge of the village. He was wearing the same yellow apron, different gloves, proper ones this time, the right size, part of the medical supplies that had arrived 3 weeks ago via the WHO response that had followed in the wake of everything that had happened in Atlanta. He looked older than Adam remembered, and also more solid, the way people look when they've been through something and have not been broken by it. They stood facing each other on the muddy path between the river and the village. Adam had prepared things to say. He had prepared them carefully during the flight from Atlanta to Kinshasa, turning them over in his mind, testing their weight and their adequacy. He had prepared an acknowledgement of what had happened here and what had followed from it. He had prepared something about the treatment. Agency 1, now in production, already reaching the hospitals in Kinshasa and in Mbandaka that had been on the original distribution list. He had prepared a professional accounting and a human one. He said, "None of it." He extended his hand. Bosco looked at it for a moment. Then he took it, and they shook hands with a firm, unhurried grip of 2 people who understood each other, without requiring the full architecture of language to do it. "You came back," Bosco said. "I came back," Adam said. Bosco nodded once. "Good," he said. "There is work." He turned and walked toward the village, and Adam followed him, and behind them the WHO team finished unloading, and followed them both, and the forest closed around them with its absolute green, and the river went on moving behind them, brown and slow, carrying it still from places no satellite had photographed toward places it had always been going. The village of Aquila was not the same village Adam had stepped off the boat into 6 weeks ago. It was smaller, not in its physical dimensions, but in its population, which had been reduced by 41 people who were not coming back, and whose absence was present in every space, and every face in the way that significant loss is always present, not as drama, but as a permanent adjustment to the weight of things. The community hall had been cleared and cleaned and returned to its original purpose, though it would be a long time before anyone in the village forgot what it had held. But it was there. The village was there. The corrugated roofs and the thatched ones and the chickens moving between buildings with their indifferent focus, and the cooking fires and the children, fewer than before but present, alive, going about the business of being children in the quietly resilient way of those who have not yet learned that the world is supposed to be stable. A boy of perhaps 8 ran past Adam without acknowledging him, intent on something in the middle distance that only he could see. Adam watched him go. They worked for 10 days. Full epidemiological assessment of the original outbreak, patient zero identification, transmission mapping, timeline reconstruction, environmental sampling from the northern tributary, where Luca the fisherman had been working when the exposure happened. Adam led the team with the focused, systematic attention of someone doing the work they were built to do, and the work was good, and it needed doing, and doing was not absolution, but it was something. In the evenings, he sat with Bosco outside the community hall, and they talked, sometimes about the work, sometimes about the village, sometimes about nothing in particular in the way of two people who have established enough mutual regard to be comfortable with silence. Bosco drank tea. Adam drank water. The forest made its sounds around them, and the river moved in the dark beyond the tree line. On the 7th evening, Bosco said, without preamble, "The man who left, the American, he survived." "Yes," Adam said. "He's recovering." Bosco nodded. "And you?" "And me." A silence. The forest. The river. "The medicine," Bosco said. "AGZ1. It will come here. It's already in Kinshasa. It will be here within the month." Adam looked at him. "Bosco, if another outbreak starts, anywhere, anything, you call immediately, not to Kinshasa first, directly to the WHO emergency line. I'm going to give you the number before I leave." Bosco looked at him steadily. "I called," he said. "Before. I called Kinshasa. Nobody came." "I know," Adam said. "You came late." "I know." The silence between them held this truth without flinching from it. Adam did not try to qualify it or contextualize it or place it within the larger framework of institutional failure and resource allocation and the structural inequities of global health response. All of those things were true, and none of them changed what Bosco had said. He had called. Nobody came. Adam had come late. "It won't happen again," Adam said. "I can't promise the system won't fail, but I can promise you that if you call that number, I will know within the hour, and I will come." Bosco looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," he said, simply, without performance, the way a man accepts a promise he has decided to believe. They sat in the evening and drank their tea and water, and the night came down around the village of Aquila, and the cooking fires went up one by one in the dark like small affirmations. On the last morning, Adam rose before dawn and walked to the riverbank alone. He stood at the edge of the water where he had stood 6 weeks ago, stepping off the motorboat into the smell and the heat, and he looked at the river moving in the early light. The brown water carrying its ancient cargo of silt and seed, and whatever else rivers carry from their sources to wherever they are going. He thought about the paper, which had been submitted to the journal 2 days before he left Atlanta. He thought about the synthesis production scaling to full volume next week, the distribution pipeline that would carry AGZ1 to 37 countries in the first phase. He thought about Patel in the lab working on the second generation of the treatment, already looking past this one to the next thing. The way scientists who are built for this work always look past the current solution toward the problem it reveals. He thought about Patricia Voss in the Emergency Operations Center, already convening the review panels, already writing the new protocols that would go into the response framework that the next team would use when the next thing came. He thought about Dennis Washington driving through Atlanta with the radio on. He thought about Sandra on the ward. He thought about Marcus Webb on the basketball court. He thought about 41 people in this village who had died before anyone arrived, and about the woman in the corner of the community hall with her hand on the chest of the child who had stopped breathing, and about Luca the fisherman who had come back from the northern tributary with a fever, and had not known what he was carrying, and had not known what it would become. None of them had known. That was the thing Adam had been turning over since room 4, the fundamental condition of it, the thing that made it tragedy rather than negligence. Nobody had known. Luca had not known. Daniel Marsh had not known. Adam himself had not known. Not really. Not in the way that knowing produces different action rather than different guilt. They had all been moving through a world that contained something they could not see, doing the things they did. Fishing, studying rivers, flying home. An invisible thing had moved with them and through them, and had become visible only when it was too late to be anything other than a crisis already in progress. This was always how it happened. This was why the work mattered. Not because you could make the invisible thing visible before it moved. You couldn't, not always, not reliably, but because you could build the systems that caught it faster, responded to it smarter, treated it better, left fewer people in villages with no name on most maps waiting for someone to come. You could get faster. You could get there before 41. That was the work. It had always been a work. It would always be the work. Adam Cross stood on the bank of the Congo River in the early morning light and watched the water move and felt the heat building already in the air around him and thought about all of it. Atlanta and Aquila and Room 4 and Dennis and Bosco and the protein moving through his blood doing its faithful, unremarkable, extraordinary work. And then he stopped thinking about it and simply stood there for a while, present in the specific morning, on the specific riverbank, in the specific light. The motorboat was ready. The team was packed. In an hour, they would be on the river, heading back toward the nearest town, and the flight to Kinshasa, and eventually the flight home. He had one more thing to do first. He took out his phone and opened the emergency contact he had promised Bosco. He wrote it on a piece of paper, the number, his own direct line underneath it, his email, his name. He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he took one more look at the river, brown and slow, moving from its source toward wherever it was going with the patient indifference of water that has been doing this for longer than anything watching has been alive. He turned and walked back toward the village. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And somewhere out there in the world, in some tributary, some market, some migration route, some place where human beings and the invisible things that move among them were coming into new contact in ways that nobody had yet noticed, the next thing was already beginning. Adam Cross walked back toward the village and the waiting team and the motorboat on the Brown River. And he was ready. End of Book 1. Dr. Adam Cross will return in Atlanta Ground Zero, The Reckoning. We have reached the end of Atlanta Ground Zero. I hope this journey with Dr. Adam Cross has kept you good company. A special thanks to the author for entrusting this novel to the Inktail Audiobooks. If you enjoyed our work, please subscribe, leave a comment, and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback truly helps us grow. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon on the channel for the next adventure.